Good morning. You're all so prompt. We shall begin. Shh. Shh. I call this meeting of the Appropriations Committee to order. I would like to welcome all members back to full committee to consider the fourth bill of the year, which would make appropriations for the Department of State, Foreign Operations, and related programs. Before turning to that bill, however, our first order of business is to consider the revised suballocation of budget allocations for fiscal year 2020. These revised suballocations incorporate adjustments provided by the Committee on the Budget to reflect funding recommendations already approved by this committee for program integrity initiatives contained in the Labor, Health, and Human Services Education Bill, and for overseas contingency operations contained in the Military Construction, Veteran Affairs, and Related Agencies Bill. The revised suballocations also make minor technical adjustments to outlays for the bills yet to be considered. These changes are non-controversial and do not substantively change the funding recommendations adopted by this committee just last week. I urge my colleagues to support them, and I will now turn to Ranking Member Granger for any remarks she may have.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. While the changes in the revised subcommittee can you hear me? While the changes in the revised subcommittee allocations are technical, I must oppose them. Appropriations bills drafted to these unrealistic subcommittee allocations will not become law. I want to work with our House colleagues, the Senate, and the administration in a bipartisan way to develop a fiscally responsible budget framework that prioritizes national security and prevents sequestration. Otherwise, defense could face more than $70 billion in cuts below the current levels, crippling our military capabilities. I urge a no vote, and I yield back my time.
Does any other member wish to speak on the allocations? Are there any amendments to the report? If there are no amendments and no further discussion, I recognize Ms. Capter for a motion to approve the revised 302B allocations.
Madam Chairwoman, I move that the committee approve the revised report on the 302B allocations for the fiscal year 2020.
The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no.
Madam Chair, I ask for a roll call vote.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The report. A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, raise your hand. A sufficient number being in support, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? No. Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Aguilar? Aye. Mr. Aguilar, aye. Mr. Amedee? Mr. Amedee, no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mrs. Bustos? Mrs. Bustos, aye. Mr. Calvert? Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cartwright? Mr. Cartwright, aye. Mr. Case? Mr. Case, aye. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark? Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Christ? Mr. Cuellar? Mr. Cuellar, aye. Ms. DeLauro? Ms. DeLauro? Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, no. Ms. Frankel? Ms. Granger?
No.
Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? Ms. Herrera-Butler? Ms. Herrera-Butler, no. Mr. Hurd? Mr. Hurd, no. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter?
Aye.
Ms. Capter, aye. Mr. Kilmer? Mr. Kilmer, aye. Mrs. Kirkpatrick? Mrs. Kirkpatrick, aye. Mrs. Lawrence? Mrs. Lawrence, aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy?
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum, aye. Ms. Ming? Ms. Ming, aye. Mr. Molinar? Mr. Molinar, no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Palazzo? Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Pocan? Mr. Pocan, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Ms. Robo-Allard? Ms. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger? Mr. Ruppersberger, aye. Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Rutherford, no. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, no. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, no. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Visklosky? Mr. Visklosky, aye. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz? Mrs. Watson-Coleman? Mrs. Watson-Coleman, aye. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, no.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote?
Mr. Lauro? Mr. Laura's asking.
Mr. Laura?
Mr. Lauro, aye.
Ms. Lee?
Mr. Harris? Dr. Harris?
Dr. Harris?
Dr. Harris, no.
Ms. Lee?
She's recorded.
I'm sorry, anybody else?
Mr. Palazzo?
Mr. Palazzo?
Mr. Palazzo, no.
Nobody else?
Floridians are not here.
Okay.
Clark? Ms. Clark?
Ms. Clark?
Ms. Clark, aye.
Ms. Klosky voted, didn't he? On this, vote, the ayes are 27, the noes are 23. The motion is agreed to. The report is approved. Our second order of business today is consideration of the State and Foreign Operations Bill. I'm pleased to present the FY2020 State and Foreign Operations Appropriations Bill, which includes insights and input from my friend and ranking member, Hal Rogers. This bill reflects congressional priorities that advance United States foreign policy. It upholds many bipartisan positions of this committee and of Congress. The allocation for all departments, agencies, and commissions under the jurisdiction of this bill is $56.381 billion in discretionary budget authority. This 3.9% increase over the total FY 2019 enacted level supports important investments to protect our national security, to fund our commitments, and repair America's reputation internationally. Let me turn to highlights of the changes in this bill, many of which reject the administration's unacceptable and irresponsible requests and policies. The 11 OCO accounts are collapsed into the base accounts for transparent accounting of the resources to fund our foreign policy and defend our national security. It also moves many reporting requirements to the committee report. The Economic Support Fund is moved from Title III, Bilateral Economic Assistance, to Title IV, Security Assistance. With this move, the committee recommendation redirects most long-term development, democracy, and governance funding to development assistance or democracy fund accounts where they belong. The Middle East general provisions are consolidated, and outdated and duplicative language are deleted while maintaining all previous conditions and requirements. This bill reverses the President's global gag rule and stops unnecessary restrictions on family planning and health funding. It reaffirms long-standing support for multilateral organizations, which expands and extends our reach and maximizes the value of the tax dollars we appropriate. Humanitarian and development assistance to the Palestinians is restored to continue the viability of a two-state solution by providing resources to international organizations working in the West Bank and Gaza. Additionally, the bill provides permissive authority for the administration to use funds in this and prior acts to uphold the goals of the Paris Agreement and restricts funds from being used to withdraw from such agreement. Conservation and environment programs are strengthened, including vital funding to stop wildlife poaching and for adaptation and renewable energy programs at prior year's level. Embassy security is funded at $6.07 billion, which is $658.9 million above the President's request. It provides the necessary resources to restore diplomatic and development capacity at the State Department and USAID by returning foreign service and civil service workforces to levels prior to the administration's hiring freeze. To address the harmful policies of the administration that perpetuate the challenges and increase migration to our southern border, this legislation strengthens the fiscal year 2020 funding directives for Central America, including the Northern Triangle countries. Significant limits are also placed on the administration's ability to redirect assistance outside of the region from prior year appropriations acts. Additionally, the bill continues robust funding for global health programs. It provides $5.930 billion for global HIV/AIDS activities, including $1.560 billion for the Global Fund, and clarifies the United States' commitment to maintaining our 33% share of the fund. Millions of women could access critically needed health care with family planning services funding at $805.5 million, of which $55.5 million is for our worthy partner, the United Nations Population Fund. This bill provides $4.165 billion for the development assistance account, including $925 million to increase access to basic education. It also maintains our commitment to food security, water and sanitation, combating trafficking in persons, and other long-term development objectives. Refugee and disaster assistance accounts are funded at $7.968 billion, including to Latin America, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. We provide robust support to our key allies, such as Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Ukraine, Colombia, and countries in Eastern Europe. The bill also provides, in a fiscally responsible manner, for the establishment of the new Development Finance Corporation, including $25 million for a new equity finance mechanism. It also establishes stringent congressional oversight of this new entity to ensure that we do not appropriate taxpayer money without knowing how it will work. Finally, in recognition of strong bipartisan support, the bill includes $425 million for the Peace Corps, an increase of $14.5 million above last year. Before I close, I want to recognize the members of the committee and the staff. As you all know, after having to reopen the government and finish the FY 2019 process, the committee was faced with a truncated timeline for the FY 2020 bill. The members of this committee have, on both sides of the aisle, done a remarkable job, and our staffs have done a great job as well. The subcommittee staffs have worked around the clock to prepare the bill and report before you today. Therefore, I would like to recognize and thank my clerk, Steve Marquez, and his team, Craig Higgins, Erin Kolodziejski, Dean Kolaris, Jason Wheelock, Maren Stein, Jean Kwan, Clelia Alvarado. I also thank Liz Leibowitz, who is missing her graduation from her master's program at George Washington University to be here today. Congratulations. And Wendy Corson, Kelly Healton, Dana Acton, Elizabeth Stanley on my staff. I also want to acknowledge and thank Susan Adams, the minority clerk, Jamie McCormick of the minority staff, Alex Pinson of Ranking Member Rogers' personal staff. And I now am pleased to recognize my ranking member, Mr. Rogers, for his statement. Isn't that the way?
I'm pleased to be working with you once again this year, albeit in a somewhat different capacity. You've been a partner and a friend of mine for many years now, and I know that we'll work together to do what is right, even though this is a challenging appropriations year. While we have all borne witness to the capable stewardship of our distinguished chairman, I want to offer my particular thanks for the collaborative way that you've led the State and Foreign Operations Subcommittee since taking the gavel in January. And I'm glad to see that you wanted to stay chairman of this subcommittee because it's been of such great import to you through the years. Throughout this process, members on both sides of the aisle have been kept informed and consulted to the degree possible. This year's allocation for this subcommittee is $48.3 billion in base funding, which is nearly a 5% increase over current year, with the additional $8 billion in overseas contingency operations, or OCO. The total is $56.3 billion. Within that total, this bill includes funding for many key priorities that are critical to our national security and that we can all support. Chief among them is $3.3 billion in foreign military financing for our great ally, Israel. We don't need to look much further than the recent headlines to understand how important and timely our support is for Israel's security. Nearly 700 rockets were launched at Israel by terrorists in Gaza, and Iran is beginning to show its true intentions to develop a nuclear weapon. Our support for Israel should never be a partisan issue. So I thank the chair for continuing this funding and for standing steadfastly by our great partner. I'm also pleased that the bill maintains funding at last year's level for those close partners in the region that are our allies, including Egypt, Jordan, Tunisia. Another shared priority is the safety of our diplomats and development experts serving abroad. This bill supports those efforts by keeping funding for embassy security at the current level. I also appreciate continued funding to strengthen our efforts on the international front to combat the flow of drugs into our country. Overdose deaths from synthetic opioids like fentanyl jumped 45% in 1 year, from 16 to 17, increasing in all demographics in virtually every state. We need to get this epidemic under control. We should also be concerned that cocaine and methamphetamine use in the U.S. climbing again at an alarming rate. That's why I'm grateful for the funding provided in this bill to help Colombia get control of its coca production as officials redouble their counter-narcotics efforts in the region. This is especially timely in light of the increased cartel presence along the border with Venezuela. I'd also like to mention our efforts to get the Development Finance Corporation, the soon-to-be union of OPIC and USAID's Development Credit Authority, off the ground. I appreciate the chairwoman's efforts to help stand up this new development finance agency in the base bill and to plus up its funding in the manager's amendment. I hope we can work together going forward on several technical issues, including those related to scoring of equity investments, so that this new agency can fulfill its mandate and give developing nations a better alternative to predatory Chinese financing. These are just a few examples of critical investments in this bill worthy of bipartisan support. That's why it's a shame that these types of programs are undermined by partisan policy writers that effectively end any hope of support from both sides of the aisle. First, the sweeping measures included in the bill to overturn the president's policy of protecting life and global health programs go well beyond what was done previously. Unless these provisions are taken out of the bill, it has no hope of becoming law. Second, the bill includes a number of problematic climate provisions. In particular, it would prohibit funds from being used to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement and allows for a contribution to the unauthorized Green Climate Fund. While I understand there are philosophical differences that we can and should debate on the merits, this bill actually adds insult to injury, retroactively applying these provisions to funds appropriated in prior acts and effectively unwinding bipartisan agreements that we collaborated to reach last Congress. The President has already declared his intent to withdraw from the Paris Agreement and will certainly veto any bill containing these measures. Third, and perhaps most problematic, we have a numbers issue. As chairman of this subcommittee over the last 2 years, chairman of the full committee the 6 years prior, I made my support clear for programs in state and foreign operations. However, it is counterproductive to continue marking up bills without bipartisan, bicameral agreement on top-line spending levels that the President will support. I know the chairwoman understands this concern well because it's a refrain I heard frequently when our roles were reversed. Budget uncertainty is nothing new to this committee, but an overall spending increase of this magnitude across all the bills is neither realistic nor sustainable without a plan. I hope we can work together to address these larger budget challenges so we can move this and other appropriations measures through the process. Before I close, Madam Chairman, I'd like to also thank the staff, both sides of the aisle, for all their hard work. You have mentioned their names, and I associate myself with your remarks. This is a great staff, and they work hard, and we appreciate deeply their great contributions. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, and I now am pleased to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Granger, for her statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for yielding. I'd like to congratulate you on presenting the fiscal year 2020 State Foreign Operations and Related Program Appropriations. The bill today, we've worked closely together on many foreign policy issues over the years, and in fact, I was proud last night to join you on the stage at the Congressional Hispanic Leadership Institute, where we were able to talk about the friendship we've had and the cooperation we've had. It was a pleasure for me. I want to thank you for your commitment to this subcommittee, even if you've taken on this enormous responsibility of being the full committee chair at the same time and working so quickly under the deadlines that we have. I want to also say I completely agree with you about the integrity and the outstanding work of both sides of this committee. We're moving very quickly, and they've had a lot to do and work very late hours, do a wonderful job. Members of this committee care deeply about American leadership around the world. I know that you do. The investments in this bill reflect not only the character of our country, they support the security of the United States and our foreign partners and our allies. The bill prioritizes our unwavering commitment to our ally Israel by fully funding the Memorandum of Understanding between our countries. It also supports Egypt, Jordan, and other partners confronted with growing threats in the Middle East. The bill includes other important investments that have champions on both sides of the aisle to advance global health, to promote democracy, to address human trafficking, and to combat wildlife poaching. A bipartisan effort last year established the Development Finance Corporation. I want to thank you, Madam Chair, for working with us to find additional funding for this new agency. I hope we can continue to work together as the process moves forward to ensure that resources are available for this unique foreign policy tool to function as Congress intended. Even though we have many shared priorities, I'm greatly concerned about partisan riders and the negative impact they could have on areas where we do agree. While I appreciate that many of the long-standing provisions to protect life were maintained, the bill would prohibit implementation of the expanded Mexico City policy and amend the Foreign Assistance Act, making such policy illegal. This is controversial language that I hope we can reverse as the bill moves forward. As we near the end of our third week of marking up fiscal year 2020 appropriations bill, I remain concerned about our path forward. Unfortunately, this bill is drafted using a top-line funding level that does not reflect bipartisan consensus, and we still have no plan to avoid cuts from sequestration next year. I hope that leadership in both chambers will work with the White House to develop a budget framework as soon as possible. We must have an agreement that can pass both bodies and that the President will sign in order to pave the way for appropriations bills to be enacted. To close, I want to thank Ranking Member Rogers, the former chairman of the full committee, and his leadership on this subcommittee, and all of our staff. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. And before I go to the next item on our agenda, I understand there is a birthday today, and we want to sing happy birthday. Happy birthday to, please stand, Lois Frankel. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Lois. Happy birthday to you. Thank you, and we won't ask you to make a speech. Happy, oh, Mr. Fisklowski.
I appreciate the recognition. Nate Sands with my office has a birthday today. Do not sing happy birthday.
Well, I know it's a good day today for the world, so happy birthday to you both. Are there any other members wishing to make general comments about the bill? Mr. Stewart.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you to the chairwoman and the ranking member. Thank you and your staff for all of your work. In the hope of setting a trend, I'm going to be brief. And unlike some people who say they're going to be brief and have no intention of being brief, I actually will try to do that. I used to fly, as some of you know, and we could fly a 17-hour mission. I could drop bombs plus or minus 1 second. I will do this in 1 minute and 42 seconds. There's great news in this bill. We thank you for that. Investments in critical flight safety programs, in combating funds for combating wildlife trafficking. A new one we just saw, looking at Confucianism institutes and identifying them as foreign agents, and believe me, they are, and they should be identified as such. But despite spending an additional $2.2 billion, we flatline money for global nutrition, and this is a huge concern. And to help you understand why, listen to this. For most of my adult life, for 2 decades, we have reduced global hunger until 3 years ago. And now for the 3rd year in a row, global hunger is actually increasing. Nearly a quarter of the children under age 5 suffer from malnutrition, and malnutrition is the cause of 50% of deaths for children under 5. And I can't imagine holding one of my children or now one of my grandchildren and not being able to feed them. And lastly, it's a humanitarian crisis as well, because we know when there's hunger that evil-minded people step in and fill that void, and we know how they do that. Last year, the committee increased global nutrition by $20 million. We would just ask the chairwoman and the ranking member to prioritize these critical funds as this bill moves through the process. And we'd please keep that in mind, and we thank you for that consideration.
I certainly will, and I thank you for your comments, and I look forward to your support of this bill, because that category is so critical.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. And 1 minute, 43 seconds. Please, everyone note as we go forward in the day.
Mr. Cuellar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I also want to, Mr. Arle Diaz, we were last night, and we certainly wanted to say thank you to both you and Ms. Granger. We recognized you last night, and it was well-deserved. So again, to both of y'all, congratulations.
And I thank you for your beautiful comments last night.
Thank you so much.
And Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Yes. I forgot what he said, but I'm sure there were beautiful words that he said. So, I do want to just mention a couple things on this bill. You know, we always talk about, and I know we're not talking about the wall here today, but I do want to say that we always focus on the 1-yard line, which is the U.S.-Mexico border, and we talk about the migration issue that we have down there. But I've always said that we need to play defense on the 20-yard line, which means that we extend our security and our assistance in many ways. So I just want to say that I want to say thank you for the funding in support of Mexico. It's a little bit shorter than what it is, but I'm sure I want to continue working with the committee to increase some of the funding as to where we were. But still, there is crucial funding for support of Mexico. I think the funding, the language supporting Mexico to promote justice reform, good governance, human rights, implement crime and violence prevention programs, facilitating the trade and the investments that we see there on the border on both sides is important. So I certainly want to say thank you for that investment. But key also is the investment for Latin America, for those 3 particular countries, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. You know, when people want to cut that off, it just doesn't make sense. And I just want to just say thank you for providing the resources for Central America, for the strategy for Central America. There's also funding also for the microenterprise and microfinance development programs that are important to those countries, because if we can create jobs and help them learn how to fish instead of just giving them the fish, is going to be important. So I certainly want to say thank you for that. There's also an increase on the educational culture exchange. And I've always said this, that if we can have students come in and spend time with us and learn how our capital system works and how our society works, that's always good. So I certainly want to say thank you to that. And then the other one is the funding for the international broadcasting operation, Voice of America, the Voice of America. And Mr. Chairman, I think you remember this. We were there, and usually when we talk about the Voice of America, we talk about Europe and Russia. But we also have to keep in mind what's happening in Central America. There are voices down there that are not very pro-American. And this Voice of America, make sure that we put voices down there, or the assistants up there, so they can talk about the United States, is important. when you go to certain areas, for example, when Chile, if you look at Chile as an example, but I'm talking more about Central America, when China is more popular than the United States and Chile and countries in South America, we got a problem. We certainly have a problem. This is our own backyard. So I just want to say thank you for all the programs, but especially the Voice of America, to make sure that our voice is heard in our own backyard, which is Latin America and Central America. So again, Chairwoman Laurie, I want to thank you, and certainly want to thank the ranking member, Mr. Rogers, also, and of course, Ms. Granger also, for the work that you all done on this, because the state foreign operation is important. But again, the rest of the world's important, but we cannot forget our own backyard, which is Latin America. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate your mentioning those priorities because I share them, and I look forward to working with you and make sure their programs, all of them, are as effective as they can be, and I thank you. Mr. Diaz-Balart, how nice to see you again. It was
Madam Chairman, thank you. Thank you very much. And I join Mr. Cuellar in congratulating both of these, frankly, amazing leaders in Congress. And so thank you for your service. I'm going to be faster than Mr. Stewart even. But I do not want to forget, however, to recognize the staff. And so if we can do that. I just wanted to mention in the manager's amendment, I am so thrilled that you have this issue dealing with the Confucius Institute. Those are insidious. They are funded by the regime. So I think that's just a really, really important part. And I wanted to thank you for including that in the manager's amendment. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Capter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to thank Chairwoman Lowy and Ranking Member Rogers for your efforts on this consequential bill, and it's clear that our nation continues to face threats to our national security: a belligerent Russia, rising authoritarianism, agitation in the Middle East and South America, a resurgent China, and a belligerent North Korea. So our country must continue to carry forward liberty's flame through diplomatic excellence and associated development support. Diplomacy takes patience and hard work, and I thank the diplomatic corps who work tirelessly in adverse situations to advance liberty's potential in our world community. The President's dangerous and unacceptable budget would have led to deep cuts in critical accounts, making America less safe. And that is why I'm pleased this Congress, on a bipartisan basis, has positioned America to carry forward as leader of the free world. This bill responsibly maintains robust economic assistance to Ukraine in the face of brutal Russian aggression. It prioritizes key challenges such as providing psychosocial care to Ukrainian veterans, cyber cooperation, energy security, and rural women's entrepreneurship to keep people there fed. I also join my fellow Ukraine caucus appropriators in thanking the committee for including a bipartisan provision to do a study on the need for Nord Stream 2 sanctions. Further, I would also like to thank the chair and ranking member for including other key priorities, such as the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, especially funding for grass carp reduction, increased funding for the International Joint Commission, and interdiction efforts to combat international trafficking of opioids into our country. Meanwhile, I'm pleased to see necessary support for programs critical to U.S. global leadership, such as the Peace Corps, Countering Russian Influence Fund, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and Radio Free Europe. Given the rise of Russian influence and increasing threats to democratic erosion in Central and Eastern Europe, we must step up our engagement, and that is why I'm pleased this bill increases educational and cultural exchanges with Central Europe, particularly in the name of assassinated Gdańsk, Poland Mayor Paweł Adamowicz. It also strengthens, as I've mentioned, Radio Free Europe and emphasizes support for civil society in this troubled region. Finally, this bill also takes steps to address the humanitarian refugee crisis in Latin America, including a program in Mexico to provide economic alternatives to farmers vulnerable to gang violence and the illicit opioid trade. But this small step needs to be part of a more comprehensive strategy. Our nation needs to rationally confront the humanitarian crisis fueled from the loss of economic opportunity and rampant violence, which fill the economic vacuums in our southern neighbors beyond Mexico, as others have mentioned, the Northern Triangle countries. America must glean best practices from our own history of how we engaged in past global refugee crises. The United States and our European allies have successfully managed resettlement and economic rebirth for millions of refugees, and the United Nations refugee experience provides helpful background as we seek to solve this challenge. We can do better than by fighting over whether a wall is the ultimate solution for continental stability and security. In conclusion, history teaches us robust diplomacy and sustainable development are critical to a safer, more democratic, and prosperous world, and I thank the chairwoman and her ranking member, Mr. Rogers, for their leadership and yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Lee.
Chairman, let me thank you very much for your tremendous leadership of this subcommittee and
I don't
for
think
including
is it on?
Is it on? For including so many priorities that really have been in many ways neglected for many, many years in many parts of the world. And also I want to thank our ranking member for your leadership and support also. And also, I must thank the staff for their very hard work on this very critical bill. As a former staffer, I know how hard staff works and the really intense type of labor and time commitment that staff makes, especially on this bill. So thank you to all of the staff. And yes, I'm proud to serve as vice chair of this subcommittee and speak this morning in support of the FY20 State and Foreign Ops Approach Bill. Now, this bill, first of all, really does give us a very important path forward to reestablish U.S. leadership on the international stage. I want to thank the chair and ranking member for including language to ensure robust investments in the Caribbean, which has been neglected for many, many years, and funding to address the humanitarian situation in the West Bank and Gaza. I also want to thank the chair for working with me to include language on the dire situation in Haiti and for the inclusion of strong language to ensure that the government of Haiti actually meets certain criteria, including addressing the corruption and human rights abuses. I'm especially pleased to see that this bill includes $4.37 billion for PEPFAR and $1.56 billion for the Global Fund, which is a $120 million increase for PEPFAR, and also language to ensure that the U.S. contribution to the Global Fund remains at 33%. This sends an important signal to our international partners that we intend to maintain U.S. leadership in this fight and that we will accomplish our goals of an AIDS-free generation by 2030. At a time when experts warn that we risk backsliding on the important gains that we've made in the fight against HIV and AIDS, we can't afford to cut back on our investments now. And this is really a global issue, and it has been bipartisan. The report includes language on the 2020 International AIDS Conference, which I'm proud to host in Oakland and in San Francisco in 2020. I want to thank the chair also for including the $750 million for international family planning, including $55 million for UNPFA. The bill also permanently, is so important, repeals the Trump administration's discriminatory and harmful global gag rule and includes a prohibition on current and prior funds from being used to implement the Mexico City policy. Women around the world deserve access to the full range of reproductive health care, and the changes included in this year's bill will help to ensure that. I'm pleased also that this bill reverses the course that the Trump administration has taken by damaging cuts to, insisting that we fully fund our assessed contributions to the United Nations. The bill provides $577 million increase for contributions to international peacekeeping activity and fully pays our CEPA arrears from 2017 to 2018. It also increases $47 million for peacekeeping operations over fiscal 19 enacted levels. Finally, I just want to quickly say that the investments in this bill really makes diplomacy, which is extremely essential right now, especially in light of the Trump administration's very clear drumbeat and efforts to create a pretext for war with Iran. From pulling out of the Iran deal, which Iran was complying with, to moving U.S. carriers in the region, the administration has continued to issue vague threats to military action and even floated the idea of using the 2001 authorization to use military force as a legal basis for going to war. Congress can't let this happen. Congress deserves to have a full accounting of the intelligence and rationale for the increasingly dangerous tensions with Iran. And so this bill makes 2 out of the 3 pillars of our national security strategies, development and diplomacy, very important as central to our overseas leadership so that we can prevent the use of force and military action to solve the complex problems of the world. This bill is timely, it's essential, and I hope it signals to the rest of the Congress and the rest of the world that we intend to use development and diplomacy as key and as priority as our national security strategy. Thank you again.
Thank you. Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This is a vitally important bill. We all know that. I don't believe we could have known, though, how critical this bill would become in the most recent years. It turns out this bill is an absolutely essential instrument for asserting ourselves as the Article I branch of government. I don't think that's too strong a way to put it. And it's partly a matter of the president's budget and the way we've taken on the most draconian aspects of that budget in this bill. But it's also a determination that we must have and we must assert through this bill to direct the ship of state, to support the State Department, to support our diplomacy, to support our activities promoting democracy around the world, and so much more. This bill expresses those priorities and implements those priorities. It could hardly be more important. It's very encouraging the extent to which this is a bipartisan bill. I understand that there are differences, but under Mr. Rogers' leadership, now under Ms. Lowy's leadership over these recent years, we have used this bill in ways that I think profoundly serve our country's interests and represent for all the world to see what our country stands for, or the values we profess, and the role we assume around the world. I want to just highlight 3 priorities that are not routine and that are features of this bill, which I think make it especially worthy of support. The first has to do with the funding of democracy and democracy development around the world. I'm, of course, especially grateful for the support for the House Democracy Partnership. But beyond that, democracy funding generally, governance funding generally, support for long-term development assistance around the world. Secondly, some areas of foreign assistance that are particularly vexing because of the President's radical, reckless action. I'm referring to the cutting off with no recourse assistance, critical assistance to the West Bank and Gaza. I'm talking about cutting off with no recourse assistance to the triangle countries of Central America, assistance that if we want to address the home country situations that prompt migration, we simply have to address. This is exactly the wrong course. And so in ways that I won't detail, this bill deals with those dilemmas which do require some ingenuity. This bill deals with those dilemmas in positive ways. The West Bank and Gaza funding, it reiterates our support for two-state diplomacy and between Israel and the Palestinians. It also addresses in a very pointed way the Central American and Northern Triangle funding. Finally, there is attention here to specific emerging democracies around the world, and this is one of the more inexplicable aspects of the President's budget as far as I'm concerned. I cannot imagine why these countries were eliminated or downgraded. But this bill takes care of that. Countries that we really need to support because they're struggling and they're involved in a struggle that we should respect and that we should help them wage. Tunisia, Ukraine, Georgia, Liberia, Moldova, Lebanon, Sri Lanka. That's these countries are singled out in this bill, and their support is protected. And I thank the chairman and others who have, the staff, others who have worked on this making sure that those countries were protected, and our commitments were that we made good on our commitments to those countries in this legislation. So thank you, and I strongly urge support of the bill.
Thank you. Ms. Torres? I do want to say we've heard such eloquent statements, many of which have come from members of the subcommittee, and I want to thank you again for your important work. Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Chairman Lowy and Ranking Member Rogers. Congratulations to both of you, and most of all to your staffs for the support and for putting forward such an excellent bill. This bill will help restore American diplomacy and development across the world, no doubt about that. I'm especially grateful for your work on the Central American provisions. We shouldn't walk away from Central America. We should be doing everything that we can to help these folks in their home countries, especially after yesterday's news that yet another Guatemalan child died in Border Patrol's custody. I think that we can all agree that we can and should be doing better than that. That's why I'm happy that this bill ensures that funds do not go to the bad actors in the region that are pushing migrants north to our southern border. And it does provide $45 million to support the fight against corruption. Finally, I'm grateful that you have provided additional funds for the Inter-America Foundation and language encouraging IAF to carry out exchanges involving indigenous groups in Latin America and Native American tribes. I look forward to supporting this bill, and thank you once again to all of you for your hard work.
Thank you. Mrs. Wasserman Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to take a moment to thank you and Chairman Rogers both for your leadership on the bill that's before us that advances U.S. foreign policy and upholds American values abroad. I'm particularly pleased with the notable changes in certain areas, including reproductive health, climate change, and contributions to international institutions. We are empowering in this bill countless women who are the backbone of their families around the world by increasing funding for family planning programs. We're also providing critical support to women, many of whom face significant obstacles to accessing health care by reversing the President's irresponsible global gag rule and contributing $55.5 million to our worthy partner, the United Nations Population Fund. Madam Chair, when it comes to protecting the climate, we are putting our money where our mouth is. This includes increased support for conservation and environmental programs and language allowing funds from this act and prior acts to be used to uphold the goals of the Paris Agreement, while restricting funds from being used to withdraw from such agreements. Madam Chair, I am also pleased with the support for Venezuela in this bill. This is a nation in crisis that needs ours and our hemispheric partners' leadership and needs us to make sure that we can continually stay engaged as the Guaido administration endeavors to help transition this country back to democracy and to essentially push aside through peaceful and diplomatic means the Maduro regime who has been starving his own people. It includes language that allocates important aid to Colombia to assist communities that are impacted by refugee and migrant populations who are fleeing the despotic Maduro regime. And I have been to the border with Venezuela and Colombia and seen firsthand the impact of Maduro's horrific policies and the torture, essentially, that he is exacting on his own people, the vital need for this funding. And want to emphasize how much we should appreciate Colombian leadership, including President Ivan Duque, who has really taken political risk here, absorbing 1.2 million Venezuelans into their country while trying to continue to implement Plan Colombia and the peace process there. And that has been critically important for that progress. Perhaps most important is what this bill does not contain, which is the traditional prohibition on funds being provided to the central government of Venezuela, with the clear hope that we might have a cooperating regime such as the Guaido regime to work with in the near future. And finally, as a strong supporter of Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship, I am very pleased that there is $3.3 billion in foreign assistance to the Jewish Democratic State of Israel. They are our strongest ally and partner in the Middle East, and not only deserve our support, but in order to make sure that we can continue to move in the direction of a two-state solution and get the Palestinians and the Israelis back to the negotiating table for direct bilateral negotiations, that assistance is critical. So thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Chairman. Really thrilled to be able to support this bill today.
Ms. Frankel.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, everybody, for your birthday greetings. Thanks to you and the ranking members, to the staff, and to all the members of our subcommittee, which I'm honored to participate in. I would like to, I'm going to start with a very simple statement, which, you know, as girls and women go, so do their countries. And I think we probably could all agree on a bipartisan basis that when girls and women are better educated, when they're healthier, when they're safer, their countries are more secure and more prosperous. So I just want to say this is a great bill for the women of the world. Thank you for that. Because it does things like this. It increases investments to combat gender-based violence, such as sexual violence, child marriage, and female genital mutilation, including restoring funding to the U.S. Population Fund. It invests in girls' education, supports women-owned enterprises, as reaches out to women and girls at risk of violent extremism and conflict. It fully funds the State Department's Office of Global Women Issues. Importantly, it significantly increases investments in family planning and access to contraception, and as some of my colleagues have pointed out, it permanently repeals the dangerous global gag rule that I will say very diplomatically, and I hope that it had unintended consequences. I hope they meant it to have unintended consequences, but I know we'll be talking about that later. This bill restores the reproductive rights section in the State Department's annual Human Rights Report. And the bottom line is this bill is about women empowerment, because we know that when women succeed, the world succeeds. I am very proud to support this bill, and I yield back.
Seeing no other member wishing to make general remarks, I'd like to recognize myself to offer a manager's amendment. I have an amendment at the desk, Lowy number 1, and
Lowy number 1.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with. You have a summary of what is included in the manager's amendment at your desk. The amendment addresses a few issues from both sides that arose after subcommittee consideration of the bill, and have the agreement of Ranking Member Rogers and myself. I urge its passage. Ranking Member Rogers is recognized.
Agree.
That's good. Are there any other members who wish to be heard on the amendment? Mr. Graves. He's going to agree, too.
Madam Chair, I just wanted to rise to thank you and the respective leaders of the committee, Republican and Democrat likewise, that have included language that I recommended, trying to address one of the emerging challenges we have as a nation. And I think we all agree in that as it relates to cybersecurity and the threats that we face as a nation. But you've allowed language to be inserted that directs the Secretary of State and other agencies, and it directs them to cooperate and coordinate with our allies across the world that we're assisting with the funds that are provided in this bill to defend against, to disrupt, and to attribute cyber attacks that are occurring against our country. And I want to thank you for that, because I think it's really, really important that we engage and we lean in on this issue. And this language also uses terms such as deploy countermeasures as well. And I think that's very, very important. So I want to thank you for that and the inclusion here in this manager's amendment.
And thank you for that amendment. Are there, who else? Oh, Mr. Cuellar.
Thank you. Chairwoman Lori, I want to thank you and Mr. Rogers also for adding one of my suggestions, and that is the fentanyl-producing countries, where we're asking for the department to work with the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland to provide us a list to the Appropriations Committee, all the countries in the world, China and the other countries, that we're asking them to give us the list of those countries that are not following the standards on prosecution of individuals producing fentanyl, because again, it's something that we cannot continue having. It's devastated our country in so many ways, and making sure that we have a list of those countries, and once we have that, then we need to follow up on the next step. But again, I want to thank you for providing this, adding this particular amendment. Thank you to both of you.
Are there any other, Mr. Newhouse?
Madam Chair, good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning to all my fellow members of the Appropriations Committee. It's a beautiful day. Madam Chair, just wanted to rise and express my appreciation. Been working with both minority and majority staff as well as members to include some language regarding the H-2A program. Now, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, you may recall I talked about this in the Labor H markup. We'll be talking about this today a little bit. And also when we consider the Department of Homeland Security's appropriations bill, I'll be talking about that as well. To highlight the fact that American farmers who are seeking a legal workforce are having to go through unnecessary, complicated, burdensome hoops in order to successfully navigate the process that we have placed in front of them. So what the amendment will do, that's agreed to by both sides, recognizes the inefficiencies and directs the Secretary of State to review the H-2A visa application process and submit a plan to this committee on ways to improve upon these issues. It includes direction to look into the feasibility of creating a singular employer form to streamline the process across each department, as well as further report on the current status of the contracting process. Farmers have to use a different application for 3 different agencies. It's crazy. And it's time we made it easier for them. We all are part of the agricultural industry at least 3 times a day, I hope, as we sit down to our dinner tables. And I want to do everything that we can, and I know you do too, to make it easier for American farmers to provide necessary food for our families. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Dr. Harris.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I do want to associate myself with the comments from the gentleman from Laredo. Anything we can do across all the agencies to deal with fentanyl, we have to do. But I want to thank the committee again. You know, on the media, they don't pay attention when we work on a bipartisan basis. You know, they always want to pick partisan fights, but this manager's amendment is evidenced by the number of people on my side of the aisle who want to get up and thank the staff for working, are evidence that we get a lot done working together in this Congress. One of the issues that I want to thank the staff for working really at the last minute on with my staff deals with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We have to send a very, very strong message that we can't afford anything that enhances Russia's energy leverage over Europe, and especially over Ukraine. In a great time of flux now, new president, we need a clear signal that the U.S. is going to support the strength of the Ukraine economy and Ukraine independence, and Nord Stream 2 is counter to that. So I want to thank for the inclusion in the language. You know, just ask the Secretary to say, look, why shouldn't we do sanctions against people, against the companies that are willing to work against our foreign policy with Nord Stream 2? I want to thank the committee again for working with us on that.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to take a moment to thank Mr. Cuellar for bringing up the topic of fentanyl and Dr. Harris. We are winning the battle on prescription pill abuse. The number of prescriptions are dropping, the number of overdose deaths are dropping from prescription pills. So that's the good news. The horrible news, on the other hand, is fentanyl, this synthetic opioid that is flooding the country. It can best be described as elephant tranquilizer. Fentanyl is extremely fatal. And yet it's being flooded into the country. It's coming from China. We know where it's coming from. Through Mexico, by and large. Mexico now is beginning to learn how to make fentanyl. It's fairly easy, I'm told. But nevertheless, the numbers of deaths from fentanyl increased 45% in 1 year. More people dying from this than car wrecks or gun violence. Think of it. And yet the country seems to go to sleep when you talk about the problem. It's not pleasant, I agree, but it's absolutely necessary that we address this matter in the most vocal and intense way. Fentanyl is the killer. And you and I are the ones hoping to save the country from this slayer. So I thank you, my friend, for bringing the subjects to the fore. Let's keep at it. Thank you. Now you bet.
And we will keep at it, and I thank you for your important leadership, and I thank you, Dr. Harris, for bringing it to our attention. I know many of us are very concerned, and I know we will continue to work together. Are there any other members who wish to be heard? The question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Are there further amendments?
Madam Chair,
For what purpose does the member from Nebraska rise?
I have an amendment at the desk as
Fortenberry, one.
modified. As unanimous consent that the reading be dispensed.
So agreed.
Yeah. First of all, let me thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member Rogers, for your leadership on this committee. I sit on the subcommittee. It's a good committee. We work hard together. We have some deep philosophical differences, and yet we also have things that bind us in solidarity to a common mission and a vision for the 21st century that is going to be a more integrated world. And in that regard, you had talked about conservation and environmental programs in your opening statement, and I really appreciate that. This amendment is a place-based strategy in the country of Kenya, one of the larger recipients of our international aid. But it's a place-based strategy that has huge implications for the consequential use of development monies. And I think, again, in this century, we have to rethink or unpack further what a holistic approach to development means. In my mind, it's that no person, no thing is ever thrown away, and that we utilize the resources that we have and we leverage them and at the same time preserve them for the well-being of persons in community. So what the amendment does is it basically targets key ecosystems in Kenya, strengthens the conservancy concept that's using the best of the market mechanism to go beyond just the national park system and set-aside areas to actually protect wildlife and bring about community well-being. Kenya is on the cutting edge of new conservation ideas, and it is an amazing, amazing place. If we can use some of our monies there to highlight the important aspects of this, I think we will bring about a new architecture of what development means. Conservation is development. Sustainability is good business, and stewardship is a noble value. So again, it's a place-based strategy, but it points to a template that could be used throughout the world to better integrate the protection of things for the well-being of community. So with that, I ask for your consideration, Madam Chair. Thank you.
I accept the amendment as modified. Does Mr. Rogers have any comment?
I agree.
All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. For what purpose does the member from Utah rise?
Yes, Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk and ask that we dispense with the reading.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The member from Utah is recognized for 5 minutes on the amendment.
Or for 1 minute and 42 seconds, however it turns out to be. The amendment is very simple. It would ensure support for countries in the critical Indo-Pacific region, and those funds and that support not be reduced in the FY19 from FY19 funding levels. Many times we're asked, what's the greatest threat facing our country? What are the challenges we have? I've become convinced, and I think this is nearly unanimous in the national security or intelligence community, that China is indeed the greatest threat facing our country. They are dishonest trading partners. They steal billions of dollars of intellectual property every year. They're aggressive, extremely aggressive in their information campaigns internationally and specifically in the region. And if you want to understand China's goals and ambitions in life, look at the Belt Road Initiative. It's very, very clear they intend to be not one of, but the single dominant force in the world by 2048, which is the 100th anniversary of the creation of the Communist Party in China. And they would like to dominate diplomatically and militarily and economically and culturally as well. This amendment conforms with bipartisan levels of what we agreed to last year. And it concerns me that we haven't maintained the same level of funding as we do see their rising influence. I think it sends a weak signal. And all this would do is simply strike the word should and insert the word shall into Indo-Pacific region strategy funding, and conforms the current law again with last year's bill. And with that, Madam Chairman, I would ask and urge others to support this amendment as well. Thank you.
Madam Chairman, first, I rise in support. What?
I'll give my remarks and then I'll turn to you.
Okay, thank you.
I do recognize myself because ensuring the United States has the resources to remain engaged in the Indo-Pacific, both through diplomacy and smart development assistance, is a goal we both share. I share concerns of many that the President's budget request for fiscal year 2020 is woefully inadequate and shortchanges our national security, and I'm prepared to accept the amendment. Mr. Rogers. Now.
I rise in support of the gentleman's amendment, which changes the word should to shall, as he says, and conforms language on the Indo-Pacific strategy to what passed in last year's bill. As the committee report points out, the United States is an enduring Pacific power. Our military, diplomatic, and economic presence in the Indo-Pacific has been indispensable to the peace, security, and prosperity that the region has long enjoyed. Now, that vision is under threat from Beijing, which seeks to displace the U.S. as the preeminent power in the region. Toward that end, China has developed a strategy of establishing military outposts in the South China Sea and elsewhere, using predatory lending and infrastructure development to advance its larger geopolitical designs, and attempting to draw the smaller countries of the region into a kind of 21st century tributary relationship. Our interests and those of our friends and allies demands that the United States, and specifically the Department of State, step up its engagement in the region. By adopting this amendment, we would be sending a powerful signal of resolve to Beijing and to our friends and allies that the U.S. is here to stay in the Indo-Pacific. Madam Chairman, I remember several years ago, on a trip to Indonesia, the delegation stopped in Bali to visit with a sage of the age. He was called the Prince of Bali. He would have been the king had Bali not been incorporated into the nation of Indonesia. And yet he was an older gentleman, almost a hermit, but a sage who helped form the SEATO alliance. And he told me something that has stayed with me all these years. He was deathly afraid of China and Indonesia, thinking that eventually China and its ambitions to reunite the greater Chinese family would swallow whole all of the Pacific. He's since passed on, but that fear now is visible. It's palpable. And this bill stands up to that, and I would urge the adoption of the amendment.
Mr. Ruppersberger.
Thank you. Mr. Stewart, looks like you have a winner here. To begin with, China is probably our most serious threat. We know Russia's there, but Russia doesn't have a lot of money. China has a lot of money. They keep spending that money to go worldwide. Their goal is 2049, 100th year anniversary, is to be the most powerful country in the world. And they feel very strongly that they can do this through cyber, through space, and other areas. Huawei, who is very much involved in the 5G, they feel that with Huawei moving throughout the world, that they can spy and get information from all of us. So we have to take China on. We have to make sure that we do what we do to protect our country and our allies. China, space program, very strong. They're going to the moon. The majority of information they got is when they cyber attacked us years ago, when we weren't as strong as we are now in cybersecurity. In terms of the Indo-Pacific region, they're challenging international law. They're taking over other countries' exclusive economic zones, trying to interrupt freedom of navigation operations, and militarizing the islands. And we've been watching them do that, and spreading their influence to push out any U.S. interests throughout the world. I think this is an amendment. It's an appropriate amendment at this time. We need to focus on China. And so I thank you for the amendment, and I hope, well, I believe it's done when you see leadership making those kind of positive comments. So good luck.
Are there any other members wish to be heard on the amendment? If there is no further debate, the member from Utah is recognized on the amendment for 1 minute to close.
Well, I would like to thank the chairwoman and others who have spoken on this. Dutch, who is a good friend of mine, and someone I think is recognized as a national security expert. He understands these issues. This amendment sends the right message to China. Without this amendment, we do exactly the opposite. And we're thankful for your support and for the opportunity to present the amendment.
The question is on the amendment offered by the member from Utah. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The amendment is accepted. For what purpose does the member from Tennessee rise?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk. I ask that the reading be dispensed with, please.
So called. Member from Tennessee is recognized for 5 minutes on the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and Ranking Member Granger and Ranking Member Rogers. Appreciate the discourse today. It's been very civil and cordial and I think productive, and I cherish my position on the House Appropriations Committee. I'm the only member from the great state of Tennessee. My amendment is rather simple, and it's to prohibit any funds in this bill from being used by the to go to the United Nations Population Fund. Now, I am avowedly pro-life. I know there are members in this room who are avowedly pro-choice. This debate should not be on the abortion issue. This United Nations Population Fund has for decades, unfortunately, acquiesced, if not supported, the Chinese policy of birth permits, forced sterilizations. Now, the Chinese traditionally had a one-child policy. They have changed that to a two-child policy. But whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, and I would like to make this comment to my friends who are pro-choice, the fact that China forces women to have abortions, the fact that China forces people to comply with these coerced policies is, I think, totally antithetical to their position, as well as to those on my side of the aisle who are pro-life. We just cannot, as a nation, this part of this bill deals with foreign aid. And if we are aiding programs like this, we send the wrong message to the world. I would suggest that we could use this aid for humanitarian purposes to truly take care of women and children and the unborn internationally. But the way that this bill is, it really would basically allow the 1985 Kemp-Kasten Amendment, which is strong supported American law. It's law in place, which allows presidents to fight coercive abortion international procedures. So I would urge the adoption of my amendment, and Madam Chairman, I yield back.
My colleagues, I recognize myself and rise in strong opposition to this amendment. It is impossible for the United States to provide assistance to every country in the world. Through our partnership with UNFPA, we extend our reach to millions of women who often have nowhere else to turn for life-saving health services. My colleagues would like you to believe that the UNFPA provides assistance through abortions to support China's one-child policy. This is simply not true. UNFPA does not provide such services. The State Department has not conducted a credible investigation to support these claims. I want to repeat that again. The State Department has not done a credible investigation to support these claims. All around the world, UNFPA leads efforts to eliminate the practice of self-selection, prevent gender-based violence and child marriage, and provide safe delivery for childbirth. In Jordan's Atari refugee camp alone, UNFPA has delivered more than 10,000 babies with 0 maternal deaths. 10,000 babies UNFPA has delivered. UNFPA is also one of the most critical partners in humanitarian settings like Syria, Yemen, where it is often the only provider focused on ensuring women and mothers get the service they need. The Trump administration has repeatedly cut off funding to UNFPA, even though there has never, and I'm saying never, been evidence that the agency supports coercive abortion or involuntary sterilizations. Additionally, UNFPA does not fund abortion services or promote it as a method of family planning, despite what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle may claim. If we wish to most effectively provide women and mothers with critical life-saving health services, we must continue to partner with UNFPA. So I strongly urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Mr. Rogers.
I rise in support of the gentleman's amendment, which would prohibit a contribution to the UNFPA. UNFPA has consistently violated the most basic respect for human life through its support for coercive abortion and forced sterilization in China, a severe human rights abuse in its own right. For 3 years in a row, this administration has prohibited U.S. global health assistance from flowing to UNFPA, sending a clear message that such coercion is unacceptable to Americans. So I can't support direct or indirect funding for those horrific acts, and I urge a yes vote on the gentleman's amendment.
Ms. Wasserman-Schultz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in opposition to the Fleischman Amendment, which is an inaccurate and disingenuous attempt to defund critical programs for women across the world. Programs that provide access to voluntary family planning, maternal health, and that promote gender equity. The United Nations Population Fund works in more than 150 countries to end preventable maternal deaths, unmet need for family planning, and gender-based violence and harmful practices, including female genital mutilation and child marriage. UNFPA also ensures access to health care and essential supplies for women and families impacted by emergencies. This amendment, plain and simple, ignores the facts and is the result of misinformation, not reality on the ground. These endless attacks on women here at home and around the globe must end, and I urge my colleagues to vote against the amendment. I yield back.
Ms. DeLauro.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I rise in opposition to this amendment. The amendment to cut off international family planning funding would lead to women and couples losing access to contraceptive services and supply, resulting in more unintended pregnancies, which lead to more abortions, of which most would be unsafe, and more maternal deaths. As has been said, the UN Population Fund, UNFPA, works in more than 150 countries. Combat maternal mortality, empower women with regards to family planning, ending gender-based violation, and female genital mutilation. UNFPA is often the only responders for women's health and humanitarian crises. In Venezuela, UNFPA is coordinating the UN health response to that ongoing crisis. They are playing an especially important role considering that the political environment is not allowing traditional humanitarian NGOs from operating. In Iraq, as Allied force liberated Mosul from ISIS, it was the UNFPA and other UN agencies that rushed in to provide 2.4 million people with water, food, and sanitation. Our own military lauded UNFPA's work as critical to securing and stabilizing Iraq. In Yemen, 75% of Yemen's population is in need of humanitarian assistance. That conflict has spiraled into the world's largest humanitarian crisis, one reason why the U.S. Congress, on a bicameral, bipartisan basis, voted to end U.S. involvement. UNFPA is on the ground. They are supporting women and their health. Last year alone, UNFPA provided 350,000 people with reproductive health support, even as many conflict-affected areas remain unreachable. We cannot improve women's health, address the unacceptably high maternal mortality, and support healthy families if women cannot access family planning counseling and the full range of contraceptive options that they want. Let's say it over and over and over again. The agency does not support coercive abortion. Contrary to the claims of its critics, it does not fund abortion services, abortion-related equipment, or supplies. Instead, UNFPA is the first responder for women around the globe. And you cannot call yourself a supporter of life if you are so willing to disregard the lives of women. Let me just say that we cannot allow vulnerable women across the globe to become casualties in the Trump-Pence administration's ongoing war against women's health in our country. Whether it is overseas or whether it is at home, this is an administration that degrades, humiliates women, and does not either respect them or the choices that they make on the behalf of themselves and on their families. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Mrs. Lawrence.
Madam Chair, I rise to urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. The UNFPA, the United Nations Population Fund, works in more than 150 countries. My colleagues have done an amazing job explaining the impact. But just reiterate, the things that they do is to work to reduce the preventable maternal deaths. The life of a mother is important as well. The unmet need for family planning, gender-based violence, and harmful practices, including female genital mutilation, and child marriage. Across the world, if you travel and go on the Codels, you'll see the state of women and their protections and their rights when it comes to reproduction and their right to make decisions about their body impacts women all around the world. I want to say in April, under the Kemp-Kasten Amendment, and reaffirm that the decision on International Women's Day in 2018, while the amendment is intended to prevent reproductive health care practices, a goal of all human rights defenders share, it has indeed been invoked without fact or evidence to push an extreme political agenda to undermine family planning and reproductive health access around the world by eliminating this funding. I stand to say, and I ask my colleagues to vote against this amendment. Thank you.
Ms. Frankel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So let me just start by saying that this assertion that the UN Population Fund coerces abortion, I call it fake news. We never hear that expression. It is fake news, but I wanted to say respectfully to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, if you have evidence, real evidence, bring it to us, not just an assertion here. Because what you're doing is you're harming millions of women around the world with this. And I don't really believe that's what you want to do. The UNFPA works in 150 countries. It provides maternal care. It treats survivors of sexual violence. It combats gender-based violence like female gender mutilation. It tries to stop child marriages. In 2016, the UNFPA provided contraceptive services to approximately 3 million couples. You know, that prevents abortions when that works. And in fact, they estimate that they stopped almost 1 million unintended pregnancies and stopped 295,000 unsafe abortions, which is something I think we all like to see happen. They were also able to reach 9 million people in humanitarian crisis and refugee camps. And I was in one of those camps, maybe with some of the people in this room. We went to Jordan, to the Zatari refugee camp, and got to witness this agency's great work. There have been 77,500 babies. I know so many numbers, but let me just say thousands of babies have been born without a single maternal death because of the work of this agency. And if you go, let me tell you another story about a woman named OM, 26 years old from Yemen. Without prenatal care, her first child was born with brain atrophy. When she got pregnant again, she found a UNFPA-supported hospital serving her rural community. And because of the high-quality care she received, she delivered a beautiful, healthy baby girl in March. So eliminating these programs is cruel. They're cruel to people like OM and cruel to, as I said, thousands and millions of other women. So I just ask my friends on the other side of the aisle, why would you want to do this on I think it's gossip. It's not real, it's gossip. And I urge everybody to defeat this amendment, and I yield back.
Dr. Harris.
Thank you very much. I rise in support of the gentleman from Tennessee's amendment. The fact is the ChemCaston language gives the administration broad authority for not only if you directly fund, but if you participate in a program that promotes abortion. The fact of the matter is China's had a one-child policy for years that actually not only promoted abortion, but, oh my gosh, it forced abortions on women. The people who stand up for the rights of women should be aghast at a country that forces a woman to have an abortion. Not only because half of the aborted babies are women, but you're forcing a woman to do something like that. So now they don't have a one-child policy. They have a two-child policy and force abortions if you want more than two. And the UNFPA partners with them. The UNFPA admits it. They partner with the Chinese family planning organization. We should send a strong message because when the administration announced their defunding of UNFPA, they didn't say we're going to take that money and put it toward budget reduction. We're going to take that money and do. They said we're going to take that money and put it into USAID. USAID does all the things you heard about, all those great things that UNFPA does. USAID does them with the restriction that we are not going to support an organization that forces abortion on women through USAID. That money doesn't evaporate. It goes to help women around the world with the ethical constraint that we should take a position in this world that no country, no government anywhere should ever force a woman to limit the amount of children they have through a coercive abortion policy. That's why I support this amendment.
We can have further discussions, but I think if you notice in our bill, it provides for a dollar-for-dollar reduction for any work that is done which you are referring to in China. Mr. Adderholt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to rise in support of Mr. Fleischman's amendment. The President has made his intentions very clear, and by a letter that he sent earlier this year, and I've got a copy of the letter right here, and I'll quote, he says, "I will veto any legislation that weakens current pro-life federal policies and laws or that encourage the destruction of innocent human life at any stage." If the policy changes are made to this bill, if they're not reversed, then what we're doing here today and spending all morning here and well into the afternoon, I'm sure, it's going to all be for naught. And I don't think that the chair's goal is to have a bill that will be vetoed or one that will end up going to a continuing resolution, because that, I think, is where we're headed if this language stays as it is. It goes straight to the President's desk for his veto pen. Congresswoman DeLauro, she in particular stated that she left the Hyde and the other labor HHS pro-life riders in because of that very thing, a veto threat. Not only is the underlying bill bad policy, but it's also bad politics. We need to get our appropriation work done. We need appropriation bills. We don't need vetoes. Again, the letter is very clear. It's not ambiguous. I will veto any legislation that weakens current pro-life federal policies and laws or to encourage the destruction of innocent human life. There's some good things in this bill today, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Let's give the bill a fighting chance being signed into law, and I yield back.
Are there any other members wishing to be heard on the amendment? If there is no further debate, the member from Tennessee is recognized on the amendment for 1 minute to close.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle who spoke in opposition have asked for some evidence. The Congressional Executive Commission on China in 2017, in their annual report, detailed specific abuses by the Chinese in terms of this coercive policy. The British Broadcasting Service has also done a story on this. The Chinese themselves, in changing from a one to a two-child policy, do not deny that they are engaging in these other coercive policies, which include sterilization and forced abortions. Whether you're pro-life, as I am, or pro-choice, as some of my Democratic colleagues are, I think we cannot err on the side of anything but the humanitarian side, and that would be to support my amendment, ban the funds to this organization. And with that, Madam Chairman, I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the member from Tennessee. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is... A recorded vote is requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, raise your hand. A sufficient number being in support, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, no. Mr. Amedee. Mr. Amedee, aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop. Mrs. Bustos. Mrs. Bustos, no. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. Mr. Case, no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, aye. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, aye. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, aye. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd, aye. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, no. Mrs. Kirkpatrick. Mrs. Kirkpatrick, no. Mrs. Lawrence. Mrs. Lawrence, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy?
No.
Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum? Mrs. McCullum, no. Ms. Ming? Ms. Ming, no. Mr. Molinar? Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo, aye. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Pocan? Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, no. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Ms. Robo-Allard? Ms. Robo-Allard, no. Mr. Rupesberger? Mr. Rupesberger, no. Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, no. Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, aye. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Visklosky? Mr. Visklosky, no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson Coleman? Mrs. Watson Coleman, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, aye.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote? Seeing none, the clerk will tally. On this vote, the ayes are 23, the noes are 29. The amendment is not adopted. No. Where is he? For what purpose? Oh, there. For what purpose does the member from Nevada rise?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have an amendment at the desk designated Amade and request unanimous consent to dispense with the reading of the amendment.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The member from Nevada is recognized for 5 minutes on the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Let's start out with a couple things that we're not saying. This is about the Paris Climate Accord agreement. It's not about climate change. I'm not going to speak for anybody in this room, only for myself, but speaking for myself, we have issues with climate change. I'm willing to say that for myself. I recognize that. The question is, what do we do about those? And so when I look, what this amendment tries to do is it gets rid of two pieces of language in the bill. It strikes the new language that makes funds in this and prior acts available for the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund is the funding mechanism for the Paris Climate Accords. It also strikes language in the act that purports to prohibit this administration from withdrawing from the Paris Accords. Okay, fair enough. The actual agreement and the funding of it. Let's talk about that. The previous administration went to great lengths to avoid the legislative process in making this a treaty. And for reasons that, I mean, we can go back and look, but reasons that I think are fairly obvious to all. And so they proceeded down that road as an executive agreement. So now the danger in that is when you get a new administration, they can treat it as the same thing. So let's look at the agreement itself and say, why is Amade standing up trying to say maybe not such a good way to deal with this? The funding of it, which was accomplished through moving two $500 million amounts by the previous administration out of a fund here in state and foreign ops, was done by executive order. So my hat is off to the majority here saying, well, at least with this language, you're trying to bring it into the appropriations process as opposed to kind of willy-nilly in it before. Having said that, let's look at what's going on with the agreement. Not that anybody's opposed, or at least speaking for myself, to dealing with climate change. And by the way, I want to do a shout out to the chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee who in that markup, or the Interior Subcommittee, in that markup put in $150 million for research on climate change. Sounds like a reasonable thing to do before you decide what the solution is. Because the solution in this agreement basically says, China, check with us in 2030. Until then, you can do whatever you want. Not that we have any economic competitions going with those folks, but let's, check with us in 2030. India, another large industrialized nation kind of gets a freebie too. Let's look at European Union compliance with the requirements. I mean, here it is. Basically says independent, none of them are in compliance. Doesn't make them evil people, but it makes you ask, is this a good way to spend $500 million on climate change? Should we be spending $500 million? Probably. Is this the way to do it? Last part I'll tell you is this. The United States, in the last 14 years, 18% reduction. Nobody stand up and say mission accomplished. We're moving the right way. And it's because of pressure from this Congress and members on both sides that we are. But when you say, I want to tie myself to that 3.5-year-old non-treaty agreement, which the Chinese don't have to participate in for another decade, which the Indians are being given a pass, and which nobody in the EU is in compliance, I guess I should say, can we find a better way? So I would just say this. The purpose of this amendment is to say we can do a heck of a lot better than this, I think, and we should. But the final piece as an appropriations organization that we are is, we really going to give $500 million to an organization over which we have no oversight over? And so, Madam Chair, I submit the amendment for your consideration.
I recognize myself and rise in opposition to Mr. Amadei's amendment. Climate change is a real threat that the United States cannot win alone, and the Paris Agreement brings 175 partners to fight this together. If the United States walks away from this agreement, which only calls for a voluntary contribution to the goals of fighting climate change, we are demonstrating that we are not serious about this global threat. Further, climate change is a threat multiplier that increases the risk of conflict, hurting our food security, our jobs, our health, and that of our children. Nature's demise will hurt us, and already, according to UN report on biodiversity, 1 million plants and animal species are on the verge of extinction. Another study conducted by Stanford shows that inaction could cost us 30% in losses in future global economic control. It is up to Congress to combat climate change, so I urge my colleagues, listen to the arguments, and then oppose this amendment. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I rise in support of this amendment. Under the Obama administration, we saw a full-out assault on domestic energy and production and consumption. Perhaps nowhere in the country were the impacts more harshly felt than in the heart of Appalachia, my eastern Kentucky congressional district. The president went on an aggressive and unabashed regulatory rampage, systematically hammering nails into the coffin of our domestic coal industry. First, he made it nearly impossible to mine coal, then nearly impossible to burn coal. And with the Paris Agreement, he worked to ensure we couldn't even export our coal to developing countries desperate for affordable energy to grow their economies. In my district alone, we lost 12,000 stable, high-paying mining jobs in what seemed like the blink of an eye. For every one of those jobs, 3 more downstream and support industries were wiped out as well. It's been a catastrophe, and we're still trying to rebound. People in my region took note when President Obama signed America up for this unattainable mandate in Paris. While many in coal countries still struggle to find work and put food on the table, the president put us on the hook to spend $3 billion to implement policies in other countries that would only exacerbate their economic challenges. Frankly, it's no surprise that President Trump's promise to put America first resonated so strongly in these communities and why his decision to pull out of the Paris Agreement has been so well received. President Obama strategically advocated for a deal in Paris that would allow him to circumvent the Congress because he knew the proposal would be dead on arrival here. It follows logically that President Trump has the unilateral ability to withdraw the United States free from interference from the Congress. As I noted in my opening statement, I oppose the language in the base bill that would prohibit funds from being used to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And I'm particularly frustrated by its retroactive application to prior acts that would effectively unwind agreements we've made on this committee on a bipartisan basis. I therefore support the amendment and urge its adoption. Yield back.
Mr. Kilmer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to rise in opposition to my good friend's amendment. And I do so in part out of recognition for the meetings I've had this week. Just yesterday, I was with the president of the Quinault Indian Nation. Her tribe resides right on the coast of Washington State. And she told me when she was a kid, the ocean was a football field's length away from their reservation. And she said, now it's our front porch. She said, every time we have a severe storm, we see storm swells, and our village was built below sea level, and we just fill up like a bowl, not to mention the threat of tsunami that they face. This week, there's a group in town advocating on behalf of Puget Sound, including some of our shellfish growers, who have unfortunately seen a threat to their livelihoods because of changing ocean chemistry as a consequence of climate change. We have 3,200 people in my region whose jobs are attached to growing shellfish and to our fisheries, and their livelihoods, their jobs are put at risk as a consequence of inaction. I met with folks from the Navy this week. From the Navy, the Department of Defense looks at climate change as a threat multiplier because it creates instability all around our world. And by the way, our Navy bases are by and large on the water. And as we see rising sea levels, that is a threat to the resilience and the readiness of the United States Navy. So I guess I rise because I think climate change is real and that we need to do something about it, and that we shouldn't be the only nation sitting on the sidelines. Yes, we have made progress as a nation, but that progress has been stymied over the last couple of years. And on top of that, I see opportunity for jobs in addressing climate change. We know that there are new jobs that can be created as we work towards renewable energy technologies, as we work towards smart grid technologies, as we work on new industries we haven't even thought of to combat this global threat. So again, with respect to my friend from across the aisle, I hope we vote down this amendment and take action on a very urgent need and a very, very urgent threat facing our planet.
Ms. McCollum?
So rise opposing this amendment. And just to give you a couple examples of what happens in the Green Climate Fund, scaling up solar in Africa. It's good for the environment, but it's also good for those children to be able to study at night. In Kenya and Senegal, working on climate-friendly cooking, good to prevent deforestation, also good because it's good for people's individual health, not inhaling all the smoke and that they do where their lungs become compromised. Kyrgyzstan, working on food insecurity. But what really hits home to me is having been down on the border, and I expected the stories that we hear about political unrest and people fleeing to escape gangs, and I heard some of that. But the people that I really got to know well, and I did get to spend quite a bit of time with them, were climate refugees, coffee farmers, people who because of change in climate and fires and deforestation had lost their farms with mudslides and that. And they were escaping because of climate change. And that's going to continue to happen, to build on to Mr. Kilmer's points. And that's why our Department of Defense sees this as a national security issue, what we do about climate change. So I know in some of our other bills, we're doing things to bring stability in Central America. But I also think this is a great way for us to double our efforts and reduce the number of climate refugees, because it's happening right now as we're sitting here. And I have to tell you, Madam Chair, with all the work I've done on climate change, it was still pretty shocking to hear the stories of why people were leaving. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Quigley.
Thank you. The thing about denial is it's really dangerous. And this is how extreme their denial is and how dangerous it is. You can stand out on Independence Avenue, close your eyes and say, there are no cabs. I promise you there are cabs. And I equally promise you there is climate change and you're starting to feel the effects in a dramatic fashion. President Obama said that this is the first generation that is feeling the real effects of climate change and the last generation that can do anything about it. We had an 83-degree day in the Arctic. It just came out this week that we were talking about record levels of carbon in the atmosphere. Let's compare the peer-reviewed scientific studies that say we're right. Peer-reviewed scientific studies that say that we're right against the peer-reviewed scientific studies that say you're right. So it doesn't help me that we're winning in that fight if you're still standing out on Independence Avenue saying there's no climate change and there are no cabs. There are both, and they're both going to knock us. We've got to work on this. Thank you.
Madam Chairwoman.
Oh, Mr.
Oh.
Simpson. Should have looked to my left.
Well, thank you. I don't stand up and speak very often, but I wanted the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, to know that I don't know of anybody on this side that is denying climate change. It's happening. The question is what we can do about it. And this is the challenge that I've raised several years in a row, and we never seem to be able to address it. Nobody in this committee, or actually in this government, can tell you how much money we're spending on climate change. There is no plan. We just feel like our commitment to addressing climate change is let's throw more money at it, let's do more. But we don't know what it is and how it will affect the climate. There is no plan. There is money in the energy and water bill, there is money in the defense bill, there is money in the EPA, there is money now in state and foreign ops. There is money throughout everything in this appropriation process for climate change. Wouldn't it be nice if we actually had a plan of how we were going to spend this money and what we were going to do and what the needs were? To know if different agencies are doing the same thing or not? You know, several years ago, when 9/11 happened, everything we did was we had to fund national security, we had to fund food security and other things. So that was the key phrase. Everybody came in, national security, food security. We got to be stable. We got to have a stable food supply. That was the key phrase. That's how you got money for different programs. Now it's climate change. So every agency comes in and says, hey, we need climate change money. All I ask is that we do an analysis of how much money we're spending, where it's going, what our plan is, and how we're going to address this issue. Again, no one is sitting over here saying, we don't believe that climate change is real. Hell, all you got to do is have a thermometer, go outside. It's getting warmer. But what do we do about it? Is the best use of this money giving it to the Paris Accords? I don't know, because there's never been an analysis of it. I would ask my colleagues to think long and hard about this, quit using it as a political football, and let's get on with a real issue of addressing climate change. I thank Chairwoman.
I would just like to make one comment. I'm a little puzzled because you have made some thoughtful comments, but it doesn't seem to me that the response is pull out of the Paris Accord. If you have other suggestions, we're delighted to talk with you about it. But let's move on.
Well, let me respond to that. I'm not sure that putting money into the Paris Accord is the right thing. When you've got China that 10 years doesn't have to do anything, India that doesn't have to do anything, other countries that aren't meeting the accord agreements, I'm not sure that that's the best use of $500 million, or whether we could be doing something else or whatever the amount is, that would be more effective? I don't know, because there's no plan.
You make a good point, and
Thank
it
you.
seems to me we have to lead. And rather than saying no to this and no to that, let's have some leadership. But on to the rest of the
Let's say
amendment.
yes to a plan. And I thank the
I'm
gentlelady.
listening. If there's no further debate, Ms. Capter.
Yes, Madam Chair, I just have to stand up and put in a word here and say I agree with the chairwoman that sometimes America has to lead. And the answer to get China interested and India interested isn't for us to withdraw. In fact, with these additional funds, we might be able to lure certain leaders into helping our world community. Our Department of Defense has told us this is the highest national security threat that we face as a country and a world, the changing climate. And you don't have to look very far. I agree with my ranking member from Energy and Water. We are experiencing historic levels of flooding across this country. The Army Corps has just told us that over 200 miles of levees have been compromised, and we're going to have to find money to try to repair just that. We know that in states like Nevada, they've had the longest duration of drought between 2011 and 2017 on record. I can tell you the congressional district in Ohio that I represent, we just received notice that it has flooded in the small slip of land because it's so gerrymandered that used to be land but now is water. And so there's a genuine question if the district that I currently represent meets the letter of the law. So the levels, lake levels on Lake Erie and the Great Lakes are rising because of historic rainfall, 125-year high. So sometimes the United States has to lead, whether it was George Marshall after World War II, ultimately resulting in the stabilization of Europe, or the creation of NATO, or indeed the United Nations itself. It's been a long slog. Yeah, I would agree with Congressman Amidei. It's kind of tough to work with these other nations, but I don't think the answer is to withdraw. I think the answer is to engage and to use our power, our moral power, our economic power, to draw the world into a solution that will demand all of our cooperation. I oppose the gentleman's amendment and yield back.
As we close the debate on this amendment and move forward, I would like to remind my colleagues, I believe there was a bill on the floor and there was a Castor amendment that called on the United States to put together an aggressive plan, but perhaps we can have a further discussion in another group on that issue. And if there is no further debate, the member from Nevada is recognized on the amendment for 1 minute to close.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate you taking this back to the amendment that I've offered instead of the editorial that my colleague from Ohio, or from Idaho launched on. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Listen, if I've confused people and not been clear, I apologize. The purpose of this amendment is not to go away. It's not to deny. It's not to go on the sideline. It's not to repudiate everything that was done. It's to say, appropriators, for $500 million, we ought to have some accountability. And also, is that the best way to spend the whole $500 million? So when I hear discussion about denial, it's like, I didn't deny anything. We got a problem. I think those are pretty clear words. We have a problem. Houston, Ohio, Chicago, wherever you want to attach to the end of that. But the point is this. You don't want to withdraw from the accords? This is a legislative body. Can we talk to somebody about amending it a little bit? Can we get some more performance measures out of it? I'm not saying you just throw the whole thing away, but quite frankly, 3.5 years ago, something that did not go through this House or the folks north is something that we really ought to visit before we throw $500 million at it to see if it can be better. Thank you, Madam Chair. You've been very gracious, and I yield back.
Today, the question is on the amendment offered by the member from the, oh, did you want to say something? Okay, the question is on the amendment offered by the member from Nevada. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted. recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, raise your hand. A sufficient number being in support, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, no. Mr. Amedee. Mr. Amedee, aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mrs. Bustos. Mrs. Bustos, no. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. Mr. Case, no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, aye. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves, aye. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, aye. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd, aye. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, no. Mrs. Kirkpatrick. Mrs. Kirkpatrick, no. Mrs. Lawrence. Mrs. Lawrence, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy.
No.
Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, no. Ms. Ming. Ms. Ming, no. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, aye. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, no. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Ms. Robo-Allard. Ms. Robo-Allard, no. Mr. Ruppersberger. Mr. Ruppersberger. Mr. Ruppersberger, no. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, aye. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Visklosky. No. Mr. Visklosky, no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson Coleman. Mrs. Watson Coleman, no. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, aye.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote?
I wish to change my vote.
And how would you like to be recorded?
I'd like to be recorded as no.
Mr. Bishop, no.
On this vote, the ayes are 23, the noes are 29. The amendment is not adopted. For what purpose does the member from Florida rise?
Madam Chairman, I have a amendment number 1 at the desk.
The clerk will read the amendment.
Ask
Rutherford,
unanimous
1.
consent that-
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My amendment today is really simple and ensures that we do not misspend funds, the American taxpayer. I simply ask that we not let us pay a bill that we do not owe. When Ambassador Haley was serving our nation as the ambassador to the UN, she led an effort to address long overdue reforms, including the adjusting the scales of assessment so that the U.S. does not pay more than our fair share, particularly in the international peacekeeping activities. Unfortunately, this bill ignores these reforms and ignores the 25% cap that was set for U.S. contributions to peacekeeping. The $479 million provided to pay the UN for what is unfairly billed to the U.S. for arrears is simply wasteful. Additionally, the administration has not requested, nor have they shown a willingness to pay more than that 25%. Moving these funds to a spending reduction account will meet the American commitment to peacekeeping while also ensuring proper use of taxpayer funds. The UN is finally beginning to address long overdue reforms. Because of renewed pressure from the U.S., we should not undercut these much needed reforms by appropriating these amounts while receiving no consideration in return. And with that, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back.
I recognize myself and rise in opposition to Mr. Rutherford's amendment. Since 2017, the United States has not fully paid its peacekeeping assessments required by our treaty obligations, undermining U.S. leadership internationally and at the United Nations. If we do not act to address this problem, by the end of fiscal year 2020, the United States will owe $1 billion to the UN for unpaid peacekeeping bills, undermining the sustainability of the UN peacekeeping system and putting U.S. national security at risk. We must take action in FY 2020 to prevent further erosion of U.S. leadership at the UN and reduce the liability of the committee in future years. We must ensure that we are not stuck with the bill for this administration's irresponsible and short-sighted policies with respect to the United Nations. Therefore, I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. Mr. Rogers.
I rise in support of this amendment. For years, the UN has been pleading, begging with us to increase the percentage of their operations above the 25% that we pay. And the only time we've been able to get any kind of reforms at the UN is when we withheld funds that they needed to operate with. Now, is that something strange for the Appropriations Committee of the U.S. House? No, it's what we do. When you want an agency of the U.S. government to do a certain thing, one of the weapons that you have is the ability to withhold funding for that agency until they comply. That's what we do. But with the UN and all of the reforms that we've been demanding of them and which they have not agreed to, here we propose to pay $479 million toward the expenses of the UN without getting anything in return. Nothing. Now, the UN and other international organizations perform many tasks that are laudable, have bipartisan support, and perhaps need to be done. Peacekeeping operations, many of those peacekeeping missions, by the way, start out well and well-intentioned, but they seem to grow bigger and bigger rather than smaller and go on longer than planned or necessary and become really a way for the nations that make up the peacekeeping force a way to pay their bills. It's unacceptable that we often find UN peacekeepers abusing the very people they were sent to protect. Just a few years ago, then Ambassador Nikki Haley proposed a common-sense list of UN peacekeeping reforms, including the need for clear, objective standards of performance and accountability. As she said at the time, we need to create a culture of performance in UN peacekeeping. The proposal supported accountability measures for failures of performance and concrete incentives for stronger performance. And they sought to use better data to match the right troops and police with the right roles in order to maximize training and operational readiness for deploying troops. These were all good ideas, and there's many others. I raised that to point out that while the majority proposes to pay these arrears, almost 500 million, it doesn't appear to be linked to any measurable reforms that we've demanded for years. What is required are meaningful reforms which address the problems that we've mentioned while making better use of resources to advance the causes that we support. Now is not the time to back off on our demands for continued progress on long overdue and meaningful reforms. This is a chance for us to achieve some of those reforms. And I urge you to adopt this amendment so that we can get some meaningful reforms out of the UN and or save some money. I urge support. Yield back.
Mr. Ruppersberger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First thing, I rise in opposition to my good friend from Florida's amendment. Ranking Member Rogers, you raised some very good points, and a lot of it has to do with management, good management. However, there are 14 UN peacekeeping missions with over 110,000 peacekeeping troops from 120 countries. And these missions are in countries that are in conflict or post-conflict situations, and they need help now. UN peacekeeping missions allow for countries torn apart by war and strife to heal and to strengthen themselves. The UN peacekeepers can maintain peace and calm, which can keep out negative influences like terrorism from growing and thriving. We make these contributions when we make them, and we make our arrear payments to make sure that these missions stay funded and we can deal with the situation now. It's in dire need. One recent example is Rwanda, which had to withdraw a planned rotation of one of its troop contingents to the UN mission in Central African Republic because it had not received sufficient funds and reimbursement. Rwanda is one of the UN's top contributors and peacekeepers in the UN mission in the Central African Republic. It is already short-staffed and currently dealing with high levels of violence against civilians and attacks on peacekeepers, and that's happening now. I fear that if we do not pay our contributions and arrears, peacekeeping missions will close. And also, if we don't have give them the proper resources at this point, we will then have to send in our United States forces. And we want to try to do whatever we can to avoid that. So I feel this is an emergency situation now. It's going on, and we need to move forward with this. I yield back.
Are there any other members wishing to be heard? Mr. Price.
Madam Chairman, I rise in opposition to this amendment. The question was posed, what does our country get from these peacekeeping missions? I think Mr. Ruppersberger has begun to answer that question. Let me add a few facts. We are protecting 200,000 civilians in South Sudan. We're combating ISIS affiliates in Mali. We're preventing genocide in the Central African Republic. All over the world, these peacekeeping missions represent not charity of some sort or self-sacrificing behavior on our part. They represent missions that are vital to our national interests. That's why we've supported them for years and why it's foolhardy to withhold support or to be stingy to squeeze this support in ways that really damage these missions and raise questions about our commitments. It's not sound policy to undercut these missions. It's not sound policy to stiff our allies or to give China increased berth to push back on these missions as they obtain a stronger voice in determining positions. Let me just elaborate briefly on those latter 2 points. Who carries out these peacekeeping missions? Many countries around the world. It's an important way of showing friendship and support for our country and for international order. There are a lot of countries that contribute to these missions, and we shouldn't be squeezing their resources, holding back on their support. For example, last year, Rwanda had to withdraw a planned rotation of one of its troops contingents because it had not received reimbursements sufficient to make necessary updates to military equipment.
So if we keep squeezing and squeezing, these countries that carry out these missions are increasingly put in a position where they simply can't afford to fully meet their commitments. And then there is the question of China. China is actively seeking to use its extended profile on these issues to influence the agenda. You think about that peacekeeping agenda, it is not an agenda with which China is going to find itself in total agreement. And so there's enough evidence that it should alarm us, I believe, that the Chinese influence at the UN, as their role increases, particularly if ours recedes, that the peacekeeping agenda might be increasingly not just under critique, but under challenge. For all these reasons, I really think it is important for what the chairwoman has done here and what this bill does to restore this support, to leave no question about our support of the peacekeeping mission of the UN. And so I urge a rejection of this amendment.
Ms. Lee.
To oppose this amendment, and just want to briefly say a couple of things. I have been the UN representative to the United Nations for our side, for the Democrats, for several years. And I visit many countries around the world and talk to and witness peacekeeping troops everywhere in the world. And I can tell you one thing. They really do help prevent violence. They are peacekeepers, but also they help the United States from becoming directly involved in conflicts by sending U.S. troops. This is really a very important part of our peacekeeping efforts. It's important for our troops not to be embroiled in conflicts throughout the world. These peacekeepers know the regions, they know the areas, they know how to help mitigate against violence. Finally, let me just say, I too have witnessed China's involvement everywhere, especially on the continent of Africa and in the Caribbean. And if we continue to pull back, China is going to gain even a greater footprint in all aspects of the economy, but also in terms of the military presence. And so I just urge a rejection of this amendment and just say that it is extremely important that we support our peacekeeping accounts for the United Nations. Thank you again.
Mr. Case.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in opposition to this amendment as well and join many of my colleagues in recognizing the value of our peacekeeping operations around the world. I spent last weekend in 2 peacekeeping operations in our world. I went to visit our Hawaii Army National Guard, who are now deployed to 2 of those operations, one in Kosovo and one in the Sinai. In Kosovo, of course, we maintained the peace and stability of that region from a very difficult time 2 decades ago. We ensure the safety and security of the people of Kosovo and preserve the ability not to go back into the past to a very difficult time for that region. And one thing I observed from that peacekeeping operation was it's not just about safety and security. It is, in fact, the projection of our goodwill around the world. There in Kosovo, we partner with 28 nations in that peacekeeping effort. Now, there is an incredible value for us to be partnering with those 28 nations. It's not just us out there in the world. It is 28 nations who care about maintaining peace in the world. And that is a tremendous message sent to many, many countries around the world, to include China. In the Sinai, we are celebrating this year the 40th anniversary of probably one of the most successful peace agreements and peacekeeping operations in our history. An effort that has, in fact, maintained the peace in the Sinai. And if we want to look at cost-benefit, let's ask ourselves, what if war did break out again in Kosovo and Serbia and that region? What if war did break out again in Egypt and Israel and the Middle East? What would be the consequence of that? There is a tremendous projection of our power in whether you want to call it hard power, soft power, or smart power. We are there. We are participating in the Sinai. We now saw the addition just this weekend of 2 participants from Japan. An incredible advance in terms of peacekeeping operations and the interlinking of many of our opportunities and obligations around the world. Japan, of course, critical to our Indo-Pacific strategy that we spoke of earlier. So peacekeeping is not just peacekeeping. Peacekeeping has a transformative effect beyond peacekeeping
beyond that to the projection of our connections, our relationships, and it is directly related to what our national defense strategy refers to as an era of great power competition. This is a valuable effort, well worth the cost, and I think we should support it on a nonpartisan basis.
Are there any other members wishing to be heard on the amendment? Mr. Womack.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, I don't have much to say about it. I mean, nobody will argue that peacekeeping is a very important part of world security, but I just want to make clear that when the gentleman indicates that the mission in the Sinai, this amendment has everything to do with the UN peacekeeping operation and nothing to do with what we're doing in the Sinai in Egypt, because as all of my colleagues should know, the Sinai peacekeeping mission is totally separate from the United Nations. You know, I had the privilege in 2002 of commanding the U.S. battalion in the Sinai, so I know a little bit more about that one than I do a lot of the other missions that we engage in peacekeeping. But that is not a blue hat mission at all. That is a treaty that was established between Egypt and Israel, of which the United States is one of 13 contingents, and the gentleman is right. Japan has added a couple of people to it, but the primary participants, aside from the U.S., that has the majority of the people there, are Colombia and the Republic of Fiji. So it's not my intent to give a historical lesson on Sinai, but I just want to make clear that we're not talking about funding that relates to the Sinai mission. We're talking about funding that relates to peacekeeping missions with the UN. I yield back.
If there is no further debate, the member from Florida is recognized on the amendment for 1 minute to close.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I could not agree more that we cannot overstate the importance of international peacekeeping efforts around the globe. I agree with that completely. And this bill does nothing to reduce our commitment to international peacekeeping around the globe. Simply says we're going to pay what we owe, but we're not going to pay what we don't owe. They send us a bill for over 25%, a few years in a row, adds up to $479 million that we do not owe. The money that we have in the budget for peacekeeping, international peacekeeping around the globe is still there. This is $479 million above and beyond what we owe. Leadership in the UN is not making foolish and wasteful decisions on our spending. That doesn't make us leaders, that makes us foolish. And so I encourage all of my colleagues to support this amendment and let the United States pay what it owes to the UN. Thank you. I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the member from Florida. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not accepted. Roll call vote is ordered. All of those in favor of recorded vote, raise your hand. A sufficient number being in support, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, no. Mr. Amedee. Mr. Amedee. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, no. Mrs. Bustos. Mrs. Bustos, no. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. Mr. Case, no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Ms. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, aye. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Grays. Mr. Grays, aye. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, aye. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd, aye. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, no. Mrs. Kirkpatrick. Mrs. Kirkpatrick, no. Mrs. Lawrence. Mrs. Lawrence, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy.
No.
Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum. Ms. McCullum, no. Ms. Ming. Ms. Ming, no. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, aye. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, no. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Ms. Robo-Allard. Ms. Robo-Allard, no. Mr. Rupesberger. Mr. Rupesberger, no. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, aye. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Visklowski. Mr. Visklowski, no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson Coleman. Mrs. Watson Coleman, no. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, aye.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote? Seeing none, the clerk will tally. I would like to remind my colleagues, we have been so efficient. While the clerk is tallying, we have 2 more amendments. And you know who you are. On this vote, the ayes at 22, the noes at 29. The amendment is not adopted. For what purpose does the member from Maryland rise?
Madam Chairman, I have an amendment of the desk, and with unanimous consent, I ask that it considered being read.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The member from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes on the amendment.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And my amendment is very simple. It reverses the language in the bill that would eliminate the President's ability to conduct the Mexico City policy. You know, Madam Chair, as we attempt to pass a foreign aid bill, we have a problem with the American public. The American public, by overwhelming margins, think we simply spend too much money on foreign aid. And the amazing thing, if you look at the YouGov Bucknell poll in this, it doesn't make a difference what age you are, what party you are, whether you voted for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. A majority think we spend too much on foreign aid. In fact, if you look at the silent generation, it's by a ratio of 6 to 1, by the baby boomers 5 to 1. You know, the group millennials, by a 2 to 1 majority think we spend too much on foreign aid. Actually, Generation Z by 3 to 1. Americans think we spend too much on foreign aid. So when we put something in a bill that's highly controversial, this doesn't help our ability to make the argument to the American people that state and foreign aid, state ops and foreign aid appropriations are in fact for the good of the nation and the good of the world. So let's talk about how Americans feel about funding abortions with taxpayer dollars. And these polls are done every year by Marist. In January of every year, they publish it for 19 years in a row. A majority of Americans feel that paying for abortions in America with taxpayer dollars is a 54 to 39 losing argument. Majority of Americans think you shouldn't pay taxpayer dollars to fund abortions in America. If you talk about funding overseas abortions, it's 75 to 19. Americans think you shouldn't fund overseas abortions. Now, the argument is going to be made, Mexico City Power doesn't fund abortions. But we just passed a manager's amendment that said we would sanction a company if it did any business on Nord Stream 2. We would think that you should sanction a company that did any business on Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Now, that's interesting because some of the companies like Shell, this is a minute fraction of their portfolio. And certainly we don't fund the Nord Stream 2 pipeline directly. We never would, because that's contrary to our foreign policy. So why should we fund any organization that has a connection to overseas groups that do abortions? They can have a facility, for instance, where you can do abortions in one part of the facility, the whole rest of the facility doesn't do it. But when you send money to that organization, even with the proviso you can't fund that abortion, you're paying for that infrastructure. And the shell game being conducted overseas, with the administration recognized and addressed in its latest iteration of this policy, is that now the shell game is you send money to an organization that sends money to the organization that says it doesn't fund abortions directly, it doesn't use money directly to pay for abortions, but it pays for the infrastructure of that organization. Americans aren't stupid. They know that money is totally fungible. When you send money to an organization that promotes abortions or does abortions, you're basically spending taxpayer dollars on abortion overseas. 75 to 19 Americans disagree with that idea. We have trouble. Most Americans, if we told them we spent $56 billion on foreign aid, they go, oh my God, we couldn't spend that money on anything better. And now we're telling them, and oh, by the way, we're now tying the president's hand to stop taxpayer dollars to go to organizations that do abortions overseas. And then we wonder why the state and foreign ops aid bill is not popular with Americans. Because, the gentleman from Alabama is absolutely right. These are poison pill policies. And, by the way, one of us is authorizing on an appropriations bill, which I know gets brought up when it's not popular. When the majority doesn't like them, they bring up authorizing an appropriations bill. The second part of my amendment strikes authorizing language inserted into this bill. I'm not one of those I believe we're the Appropriations Committee, we can authorize on appropriations bills consistent with the rules, and we do it. In this case, we shouldn't do it. The bottom line is this is not popular with Americans. This is a policy that we should strike from the bill, and we certainly, if we hope this state and foreign aid ops bill is going to be signed by the president, we should not be putting in these poison pill limitation amendment or limitation rider and the new authorizing language that makes this restriction permanent. With that, I support my amendment.
I recognize myself, and I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. We've known from past implementations of the global gag rule that this anti-woman policy increases maternal mortality and leads to more, not less, abortions. But this administration took this disastrous policy and made it worse in 2017 by expanding it to all global health assistance, politicizing the provision of basic health care needs. Even more egregious, this decision was made with no analysis of its impact or even serious consideration of how it could be implemented without serious harm to other health programs. Since the expansion, implementers have been forced to shutter facilities, often in underserved areas, cutting off thousands of men, women, and children from services for HIV/AIDS, malaria, maternal health, and more. And this year, the administration further expanded the policy, applying it not to just NGOs receiving U.S. funds, but also to any organization supported by these NGOs, even with non-U.S. funds. This madness, frankly, has led to chaos and confusion, creating a chilling effect in which organizations unnecessarily change or eliminate vital health services for fear of running afoul of the United States government. This must stop. That is why the bill before us prioritizes health and development over politics, allowing us to save lives, strengthen health systems, and maintain global health leadership. Let me also be very clear that this bill does not change any of the current provisions in law that restrict U.S. funds from going to abortion overseas. I'll say it again. This bill does not change any of the current provisions in law that restrict U.S. funds from going to abortion overseas. Since 1973, the Helms Amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 has prevented any U.S. tax dollars from funding abortion overseas. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I rise in support of this amendment. I am grateful to the chair for maintaining a number of longstanding pro-life provisions in the bill, stemming from the basic proposition that U.S. taxpayers should not be forced to fund abortions, either domestically or abroad. The President's expanded Mexico City policy affirms our nation's respect for unborn life by requiring foreign NGOs to agree. If they want American tax dollars to support their work, they will not perform or promote abortion as a method of family planning. Without strong protections in our bill, the International Family Planning Account becomes a funding stream for foreign organizations that do not adhere to these guidelines. This amendment would ensure those guardrails are in place. So I urge a yes vote. Yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in opposition to this amendment, which actually seeks to codify the global gag rule. This week, Alabama passed a law that gave millions of Americans a terrible moment of pause. Their new anti-choice legislation would have the result of forcing teenage survivors of rape to remain pregnant without their consent. An egregious and a callous decision. And this amendment would allow the Trump-Pence administration to continue to export these extreme policies abroad. The global gag rule prohibits international organizations from receiving health funding even if they do not use U.S. aid for informational, medical, or referral services to advocate for safe and legal abortion in their own countries. Also known as the Mexico City policy, this prohibition has long been a tool of anti-women conservatives to appease anti-choice advocates at the expense of women in struggling nations, including those in Central America and in sub-Saharan Africa. Targeting vulnerable women in troubled areas of need in order to score political points at home is frankly heartless. We should not be forcing teenage survivors, or any woman for that matter, of rape or incest living in places like Alabama to remain pregnant against their consent. And we should not be exporting these unconscionable policies across the globe. You know, doctors take a Hippocratic oath to do no harm. And we as a Congress ought to aspire to do the same, to do no harm. And yet this amendment would have the result of doing harm to women's reproductive health and their well-being of women across the globe. As I said in prior remarks on an earlier amendment, this is about this administration's continuing to degrade, to humiliate, to denigrate women, not allowing any respect or dignity for women either in the United States or in this world to be able to make choices about themselves and about their families. I urge my colleagues to please oppose this amendment.
Ms. Lee.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I rise in strong opposition to this amendment and associate myself with your remarks and that of our ranking member, our chair of the Labor H Subcommittee, Congresswoman DeLauro. Let me just add to this. They're estimated, I think it's 214 million women in developing regions who want to avoid pregnancy but are not using modern contraception. Policies like the global gag rule pose unnecessary obstacles to their ability to get access to the contraception that they need. This has nothing to do with promoting abortions. This is outrageous, this amendment. The United States government should have no role in forcing another country to choose between limiting the advice they give to patients based on their own laws and maintaining the global health assistance that they rely on. Actually, very recently, there is a poll taken by a Heart Research Group that says that it concluded, and the findings were that 70% of Americans actually oppose the global gag rule. And we've already seen the impact of these policies on our efforts to address the global HIV and AIDS pandemic. Research has shown that the expanded global gag rule has forced many PEPFAR implementing partners to alter the services and the information that they provide, and that disruption in services were reported in 31 of the 45 countries surveyed. Madam Chair, I have served on this committee for a while now, and one thing is clear. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle will stop at nothing to prevent women from gaining the access that they need and deserve for comprehensive reproductive rights. They oppose comprehensive sex education, family planning and counseling, birth control and contraception, access to legal abortions, while at the same time often seeking to undermine programs that will help families, women, and children thrive, like investing in child care and early childhood education and access to child care. Reproductive health care is health care. Women's health care is health care. And health care is a basic human right, and women's rights are human rights. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment.
Mr. Quigley.
Madam Chairman, these actions have consequences. Since the President reinstated the global gag rule in 2017, 3 rural health care clinics closed in Senegal. Multiple clinics closed in Burundi that offer HIV testing and sex education are also set to close. Funding for the clinics in Mozambique has dramatically decreased, affecting 500,000 people. A clinic director in Kenya called the global gag rule a, quote, death sentence for her patients because it leads to more maternal deaths, more unwanted pregnancies, and more unsafe abortions. Senegal is already seeing these effects. Health workers have noted an increase in unsafe abortion, teen pregnancy, and STIs. Low-income countries, vulnerable communities, and underserved populations rely heavily on funding from USAID and other U.S. sources to prevent adverse health effects. Stripping funding for healthcare services away from them for ideological reasons is unconscionable.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I also rise in opposition to the Harris Amendment, which is yet another Republican unfortunate attempt to undermine women's access to family planning around the globe. The global gag rule prohibits foreign organizations from receiving any U.S. global health assistance if they provide information, referrals, or services for legal abortion or advocate for the legalization of abortion in their country, even if these activities are supported by non-U.S. funds. The consequences of the global gag rule have been severe, including increases in unintended and high-risk pregnancies, unsafe abortions, and maternal deaths. By forcing healthcare providers to withhold information from their patients, this amendment violates the trusted relationship between a woman and her doctor. Reproductive care is a human right. And that's why nearly 170 groups representing issues from healthcare to LGBTQ rights to labor have explicitly opposed the global gag rule. We cannot support and should not support backwards policies that have devastating effects on women around the world. It is time to end the global gag rule once and for all, and I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment. I yield back.
Ms. Franco.
Well, my, here we go again. Here we go again. Politicians trying to control the bodies of women. Now, this is not about abortion. This is about controlling women's bodies. There is a war on women. In fact, sign me up, because I'm going to battle. And if there was a window in this room, you know what I would be doing? I'd put my head out the window and I would be screaming, I can't take it anymore. And I'm going to tell you what, the women in this country are not going to take it anymore. Politicians trying to control our bodies, not only here in this country, but now around the world with dramatic consequences. And I'm going to say politely, I hope they're unintended consequences. Right? I'm signing Norma up too. Thank you, Representative. Since 1973, the Helms Amendment has restricted U.S. foreign assistance for abortion. That's a fact. I don't agree with it, but it's a fact. We've lived with it. And now we had the global gag rule, which prohibited foreign organizations from getting money to do health care. This was in family planning, and now it's been expanded. Now it's on steroids. The Trump administration has put the gag rule on steroids, and now billions of dollars of health care funds are being affected here. I don't even call it the choke. I don't call it the gag rule. I call it the choke rule. This is the global choke rule because it's going to lead to more morbidity and more deaths. And I know this is not what my colleagues on the other side of the aisle intend, so I hope you really think about it. I'm going to talk about Celeste. She's a 31-year-old mother of two living in Mozambique. She lost her husband from AIDS. She found a clinic that was run by the Association for Family Development, and she discovered she was HIV positive. And the clinic gave her medication to stay healthy. If it wasn't for those visits, she wouldn't be alive today, and who would be taking care of her children? But here's what's happened. This association that ran this clinic has now lost their U.S. funding. They've shut down 90 clinics, including the one where Celeste went to. Now, where do you want her to go? Where should she go just for primary health care? She's out. She's out of luck. And let me just say something. There was some mention about foreign aid and so forth. Let me tell you something. Disrupting U.S. aid for global health would be a huge mistake. It would make the world a scarier place for Americans. It would lead to greater risk of deadly infectious diseases for us. It would diminish U.S. economic opportunities and loss of influence. And at the same time, millions of people around the world are going to suffer needlessly. So I think, Representative Lee, you mentioned some statistics. I'm not going to go over all of them again, but I think you said 225 million women in developing countries want to prevent or delay pregnancy, according to the World Health Organization. And yet they don't have access to contraception. Let me ask you something. When you have access to contraception, doesn't that prevent abortion? Yes. Does it? I thought so. I learned that. Yeah, I think so. So I don't understand where my friends are coming from. Maurice Stopes International, a leading healthcare provider, estimates it will lose $100 million in U.S. funding, leading to, listen to this, I don't really like statistics, but I'm going to give them anyway, leading to 20,000 maternal deaths, 4.8 million unintended pregnancies, and 1.7 million unsafe abortions. That's just from the loss of funding from that one organization. And I just say to people out here, don't you want our children to be loved and wanted and cared for? I think we all agree with that. So I'm going to end by saying this. This amendment does more than just gag health care providers. It will kill and maim millions of women around the world, and we should defeat it. I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's necessary to point out that if the United States provides money overseas, we have every right to determine how that money will be used. The Trump administration, by upholding the Mexico policy and by properly applying it, has not only upheld a principle of American values that, as Dr. Harris rightly points out, most people agree with. But it's also sound diplomacy. By not exporting our most divisive discussions, our most divisive consideration in our culture onto other people. So I think this is a reasonable amendment. It's one that has been done in the past. It's now being properly applied, and it's consistent with sound diplomacy. I yield back.
Mrs. Lawrence.
I want to start with 214 million women in developing regions who want to avoid pregnancy are not using modern means of preventing pregnancies. And this policy provides additional challenges to their ability to get contraceptives. I just want to say, any woman who is sitting here that is in the childbearing age range, you're either pregnant or using a contraceptive unless you're medically unable to get pregnant, or unless we want to pass a rule that in addition to prohibiting knowledge about contraceptives, that we prevent people from having sex. This is the road we're going down. And then you say women don't have abortions, but you're going to cut funding that would allow them to have contraceptives. This slippery slope is getting longer and longer. First it started off, we don't want abortions. Now we don't want you to have contraceptives. So what's next? Don't have sex until a man tell you you can? And then, as one of the colleagues said at one time, hold your legs together and you won't get pregnant. We in America are intelligent people. We are leaders in the free world. We are the people who have shown compassion and morals. Why are women under attack? I have not heard a single discussion about what men should do with their bodies and their reproductive health. Do we have a right to sit here in Congress and say when you can have a vasectomy? Because if you have a vasectomy, you are then having an abortion by man. Do we want to talk about that? Do we want to talk about the reproductive health? Or do we want to talk about the rights of a human being to decide when they will have a child? And not to abort, but to get the contraceptives and get the funding so that we can have women who are poor in some of these countries and have no control. Forced childhood marriages. And the conversation that we're having about if a woman is raped or she's a victim of incest, can you imagine a 12-year-old being raped by a family member and you look her in the eye and say, you don't even know what's happening, have that baby? Can you imagine a woman who's dragged down the street, beaten and raped and traumatized? She's going to be forever changed as a woman because of that trauma. And you're going to say, for 9 months, I, as a man in Congress, will tell you, you must have that baby. Are you going to show up and help her? Are you going to show up and hold her hand during that time? Are you cutting funding that she would need? America, please, they're listening to us. And every man in this room, unfortunately, it's only 25% women in this Congress. It's too many of you men making these outrageous bills that impact 52% of the Americans in this country. And I will end with this. I am pro-choice so that every woman who wants to be pro-life has the right to have her baby. I was blessed with 2 pregnancies and I had both of them. Every woman should have that right. And I yield back. Oppose this.
Before I call on Mr. Quayle, may I remind my colleagues, please direct your comments to the chair. Mr. Quayle.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have an inquiry, if I could ask the chair. The Hyde Amendment has been with us. I think the original one was on September 30th, 1976. That basically now the way it's involved is that the Hyde Amendment says that no federal funds will be used for abortion with certain exceptions. My question, I think you said this at during your original presentation. I just want to make sure that all members understand this. The Hyde Amendment is still the law of the land. Is that correct?
Correct.
Thank you
And
so
I
much.
want to make this very, very clear. This bill does not change any of the current provisions in law that restrict U.S. funds going to abortion overseas. Got it? Since 1973, the Helms Amendment to the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 has prevented any U.S. tax dollars from funding abortion overseas. Hyde is in effect, even though I may disagree with the policy, it is in effect, and I thank you for your question, and I'm hoping that my colleagues understand the facts. Thank you.
Thank you for that explanation. Thank you.
Are there any other members wishing to be heard on the amendment? Madam Clark.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to associate myself with the comments made by my colleagues in opposition to this amendment. Instead of protecting life, this global gag rule has put life-saving health services, particularly sexual and reproductive health services, out of reach for people and communities who already have limited access to affordable, high-quality health care. And I am proud to stand with the 170 diverse groups that oppose this gag rule. They take the range from faith-based to child and maternal health, environmental, anti-human trafficking groups, and I urge all of us to oppose this amendment. But I just wanted to make one further comment in line with what my colleague, Mr. Cuellar, just said. I think we have to keep in mind the slippery slope that is in this amendment. We have the Hyde Amendment as the law of the land. We have the Helm Amendment as the law of the land. We do not fund abortions. Some of us would like to revisit that policy, but we have not in this appropriation bill, and we are not proposing to do so. What concerns me is, where does this stop? When we start talking about, no, we're not changing that direct funding, but this impacts infrastructure of healthcare, and we have to weed this out somewhere. What are we going to say to hospitals like the one that Dr. Harris worked for that performs abortions? Will they no longer qualify for NIH grants, life-saving grants and research? Are we going to say that they are no longer allowed to have Medicare and Medicaid as payment forms because there are some U.S. tax dollars there? We have to be careful in what we are doing. We have to take the long-term view, the long-range view, and understand that our role when we help not only the women of this country, but women and girls and children around the world have peace, education, and good health care. That is our strongest form of might that we can have as a country that is trying to promote peace, goodwill, and economic prosperity to countries across the globe. So I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment.
Mr. Adderholt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And again, there's been a lot of discussion about this particular amendment, and I rise in strong support of the amendment. But I want to also get back to what I had mentioned in the last amendment we had regarding this issue when Mr. Fleshman brought his amendment up. The President has made his intentions clear. Again, I've got the letter here. My office brought it to me. That the President will veto any legislation that weakens the current pro-life federal policies or laws or that encourages the destruction of innocent human life at any stage. I mentioned there's a lot of good things in this bill, but right now, if the bill stands as it is, it will be vetoed, and then we could very easily go toward a continuing resolution. All the good things that are in this bill will be for naught. So again, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Let's give the bill a chance and to be signed into law, and I yield back.
Are there any other members wishing to be heard on this amendment? If there is no further debate, the member from Maryland is recognized on the amendment for 1 minute to close.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. My, how extreme the pro-abortion lobby has become. 75% of Americans oppose funding of taxpayer dollars overseas abortions. Pro-abortion lobby favors it. The governors of New York and Virginia talk about allowing a baby to die born alive. The majority in Congress, in the House, will not vote on the Born Alive Act, which 75% of Americans support. How extreme the pro-abortion lobby has become. This is not about health care. This is about abortion, because out of 733 prime providers under this program, only 4 have declined to participate under the Mexico City policy. You know, quoting Marie Snopes about this, like quoting Exxon about fossil fuels. They stand to lose tens of millions of dollars under this program. How extreme the pro-abortion lobby has become. I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the member from Maryland. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. No! In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted. A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of recorded vote, raise your hand. A sufficient number being in support, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, no. Mr. Amberday. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, no. Mrs. Bustos. Mrs. Bustos, no. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. Mr. Case, no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Lauro. Mr. Lauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, aye. Ms. Frankel. Ms. Frankel, no. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Grays. Mr. Grays, aye. Dr. Harris. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Ms. Herrera-Butler, aye. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd, aye. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer, no. Mrs. Kirkpatrick. Mrs. Kirkpatrick, no. Mrs. Lawrence. Mrs. Lawrence, no. Ms. Lee. Ms. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy.
No.
Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum. Mrs. McCullum, no. Ms. Ming. Ms. Ming, no. Mr. Molinar. Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo, aye. Ms. Pingree. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Pocan. Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley. Mr. Quigley, no. Mrs. Roby. Mrs. Roby, aye. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Robo-Allard. Mr. Robo-Allard, no. Mr. Ruppersberger. Mr. Ruppersberger, no. Mr. Rutherford. Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Serrano. Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, aye. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Viscoski. Mr. Viscoski, no. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz. Ms. Wasserman-Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson-Coleman. Mrs. Watson-Coleman, no. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, aye.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote? Seeing none, the clerk will tally.
One more. Easy one compared to this. I have your talking point. Hit your mic.
On this vote, the ayes are 22, the noes are 29. The amendment is not adopted. For what purpose does the member from Florida rise?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk and ask unanimous consent to dispense with the reading.
Rutherford, number 2.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I offer this amendment today because of the unsustainable financial situation that we are in. This state and foreign operations bill supports many important investments that demonstrate our leadership around the world. It funds key security assistance programs for our partners and allies, as well as global health initiatives, but we cannot deny that the U.S. government is $22 trillion in debt. This bill's allocation is more than 4% above last year, which is not in line with the budget reality that we now face. We need to look at all the programs in the bill to see where we can make reductions, and I believe the Economic Support Fund is where we can do just that. Because of the nature of this fund, the dollars are spent very slowly. And in fact, there are currently billions of dollars currently unobligated in the fund. So we can eliminate this spending without much, if any, impact on programs. Reducing this balance by $100 million will demonstrate good oversight and management resources. I hope members on both sides of the aisle will agree that we can reduce spending by this small amount without any or much impact. And I urge a yes vote on this amendment.
I recognize myself and I rise in opposition. This amendment would rescind much-needed foreign assistance at a time when America should be expanding its diplomatic presence, not contracting. Congress just finished adjudicating the fiscal year 2019 appropriations a few months ago, rejecting the cuts proposed in the President's foreign assistance budget request. We are still awaiting details of the administration's plan for spending those funds. This amendment would renege on that deal struck just months ago. And this time last year, the Republican leadership of this committee chose not to take action on a rescission proposal by the administration. And ever since OMB and state have been dragging their feet on obligating the funding we have appropriated. This amendment really does send a mixed message considering all we've done to reject the president's cuts and ensure timely expenditures in this bill. It also could have unforeseen consequences, and I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. Mr. Rogers.
I thank the gentlelady. I rise in support of the gentleman's amendment. There are significant balances in the ESF account. We can afford to take a small cut to this bill without a programmatic impact. So I urge a yes vote on the amendment. Yield back.
Are there any other members wishing to be heard on the amendment? If there's no further debate, the member from Florida is recognized on the amendment for 1 minute to close.
Madam Chair, I would just point out that, again, because of the nature of this fund and those unobligated funds that do exist, as was just pointed out by Mr. Rogers, that we can actually make these cuts and have little or no impact at all on these programs. And so I think it's wise for us as appropriators that we're staring at $22 trillion in debt, that we can certainly find $100 million in this account that will have little to no impact on programming. And I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the member from Florida. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not adopted. A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, raise your hand. A sufficient number being in support, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, no. Mr. Amedee. Mr. Amedee, aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop, no. Mrs. Bustos. Mrs. Bustos, no. Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Cartwright, no. Mr. Case. Mr. Case, no. Ms. Clark. Ms. Clark, no. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Chris. Mr. Chris, no. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. DeLauro. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Diaz-Balart, aye. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry. Mr. Fortenberry, aye. Ms. Frankel? Ms. Frankel, no. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, aye. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, aye. Mr. Rare Butler? Mr. Rare Butler, aye. Mr. Hurd? Mr. Hurd, aye. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter? Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kilmer? Mr. Kilmer, no. Mrs. Kirkpatrick? Mrs. Kirkpatrick, no. Mrs. Lawrence? Mrs. Lawrence, no. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy? No. Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum, no. Ms. Ming? Ms. Ming, no. Mr. Molinar? Mr. Molinar, aye. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo, aye. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Pocan? Mr. Pocan, no. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, no. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, aye. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, aye. Ms. Robo-Allard? Mr. Robo-Allard, no. Mr. Ruppersberger? Mr. Ruppersberger, no. Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Rutherford, aye. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart? Mr. Stewart, aye. Mrs. Torres? Mrs. Torres, no. Mr. Visklowski? No. Mr. Visklowski, no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mrs. Watson Coleman? Ms. Watson Coleman, no. Mr. Womack? Mr. Womack, aye.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote? Seeing none, the clerk will tally. The ayes are 23, the noes are 29. The amendment is not adopted. Is there any further amendment or discussion? Seeing none, I recognize the gentlewoman from Ohio for a motion, and I ask for your support for this bill.
Madam Chairwoman, I move to favorably report the State and Foreign Operations Appropriation Act 2020 to the House.
The question is on the motion. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Yes. A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote, raise your hand. A sufficient number being in support, a recorded vote is ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt? Mr. Adderholt, no. Mr. Aguilar? Mr. Aguilar? Mr. Aguilar? Mr. Aguilar, aye. Mr. Amadei? Mr. Amadei, no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, aye. Mrs. Bustos? Mrs. Bustos, aye. Mr. Calvert? Mr. Calvert? Mr. Calvert, no. Mr. Carter? Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Cartwright? Mr. Cartwright, aye. Mr. Case? Mr. Case, aye. Ms. Clark? Ms. Clark, aye. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Christ? Mr. Christ, aye. Mr. Cuellar? Mr. Cuellar, aye. Mr. Loro? Mr. Loro, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart? Mr. Diaz-Balart, no. Mr. Fleischman? Mr. Fleischman, no. Mr. Fortenberry? Mr. Fortenberry, no. Ms. Frankel? Ms. Frankel?
Ms. Frankel?
Ms. Frankel, aye. Ms. Granger? Ms. Granger, no. Mr. Graves? Mr. Graves, no. Dr. Harris? Dr. Harris, no. Mr. Rare Butler? Mr. Rare Butler, no. Mr. Hurd? Mr. Hurd, no. Mr. Joyce? Mr. Joyce, no. Ms. Capter?
Aye.
Ms. Capter, aye. I cannot hear. They need to stop talking. I cannot hear. Bang your gavel. I can't hear.
We're almost at the end. Could we have your attention so we can hear?
Mr. Kilmer? Mr. Kilmer, aye. Mrs. Kirkpatrick? Mrs. Kirkpatrick, aye. Mrs. Lawrence? Mrs. Lawrence, aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee, aye. Mrs. Lowy?
Aye.
Mrs. Lowy, aye. Ms. McCullum? Ms. McCullum, aye. Ms. Ming? Ms. Ming, aye. Mr. Molinar? Mr. Molinar, no. Mr. Newhouse? Mr. Newhouse, no. Mr. Palazzo? Mr. Palazzo, no. Ms. Pingree? Ms. Pingree, aye. Mr. Pocan? Mr. Pocan, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Quigley? Mr. Quigley, aye. Mrs. Roby? Mrs. Roby, no. Mr. Rogers? Mr. Rogers, no. Ms. Robo-Allard? Mr. Robo-Allard, aye. Mr. Ruppersberger? Mr. Ruppersberger, aye. Mr. Rutherford? Mr. Rutherford, no. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Serrano? Mr. Serrano, aye. Mr. Simpson? Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Stewart, no. Mrs. Torres. Mrs. Torres, aye. Mr. Visklowski. Mr. Visklowski, aye. Ms. Wasserman Schultz. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, aye. Mrs. Watson Coleman. Mrs. Watson Coleman, aye. Mr. Womack. Mr. Womack, no.
Does any member wish to record their vote or change their vote? Yes,
As an aye.
as an aye.
Mr. Simpson, no.
What do I say now? That's it?
You say the clerk will tally.
The clerk will tally.
We don't need them here to finish.
No, we don't need anything else.
No, we do. We got to finish. They don't need to be here, though.
On this vote, the ayes at 29, the noes at 23, the motion is agreed to. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be permitted to make technical and conforming changes to the bill and report just approved. Seeing no objection, so ordered.
3 days.
Good. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.